He slammed the door so hard the whole porch shook. That was the moment Lenora Blythe understood she had made a terrible mistake not in coming to Ironpine Ridge, but in assuming that a man who wrote honest letters could possibly be this cold in person. Calder Rusk didn't yell. He didn't curse. He simply turned his back on her, walked into the barn, and let the silence do the cruelty for him. 9 women had stood on that same porch. 9 women had packed their bags and left. Lenora stood in the bitter mountain wind, her trunk still sitting in the mud, and made a decision that would change both their lives forever. She didn't move. If this story already has your heart racing, you're going to want to stay until the very last word, because what happens between Calder Rusk and Lenora Blythe on that ridge is the kind of story that doesn't let go of you. Subscribe to this channel right now so you never miss what comes next. And while you're at it, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I genuinely want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning, because to understand why Lenora refused to leave, you first have to understand what she left behind. The letter had arrived on a Tuesday, tucked between a notice from the general store and a past due bill that Lenora had no business ignoring. She almost didn't open it. She had responded to 3 similar advertisements in the past 2 years, and each one had ended badly, not violently, not dramatically, just badly in that quiet, erosive way that leaves a woman questioning her own judgment. But she opened it. The handwriting was blunt, no curled letters trying to look elegant. No flattery in the opening line. It read more like a contract than a courtship, which was precisely why she read it twice. I run a cattle operation on Ironpine Ridge above Red Willow Crossing. The work is hard. The winters are worse. I need someone capable of managing a household through difficult conditions, not someone who expects the conditions to change. If you require warmth and conversation to feel settled, this arrangement will not suit you. If you can work and think and make decisions without being told how, write back. I will pay for your travel. Calder Rusk, no flattery. No promises of love. No suggestion that the right woman would soften him, or that the mountain air was beautiful in autumn, or that loneliness had a way of making a man reconsider his priorities. Just the truth bluntly delivered. Take it or leave it. Lenora had sat at her kitchen table in the small rented room she kept above the milliner's shop in Harwick for 37 minutes, she counted, before she picked up her pen and wrote back. She had known genuinely cruel men. She had been engaged once, briefly, to a man in Harwick who used words like weapons and then apologized so convincingly afterward that she'd believed him 3 times before she finally didn't. She had worked for a family in the county seat whose husband smiled at church and made his wife cry in the kitchen. She had watched women mistake coldness for strength and strength for love, and love for something that would eventually break them. So when she read Calder Rusk's letter and found no sweetness in it, she did not feel warned away. She felt something closer to relief. At least she knew exactly what she was walking into. That, as it turned out, was only partly true. The stagecoach dropped her at Red Willow Crossing on a Wednesday morning in late October, when the sky had that flat pewter quality that means the cold is already committed. It's not threatening anymore. It's arrived. Lenora stepped down from the coach with a trunk, a traveling bag, and the particular composure of a woman who had learned not to let strangers see her uncertainty. The town was small enough that her arrival was immediately noticed. She felt eyes on her from the general store porch, from the doorway of what appeared to be a saloon, from a woman sweeping steps across the road, who stopped sweeping the moment the stagecoach stopped. Lenora straightened her coat, checked that her hat was level, and looked around for whoever was supposed to meet her. She spotted him immediately, not because he stood out in a friendly way, but because he was the only person on that main road who wasn't looking at her. Calder Rusk stood beside a wagon at the far end of the street, checking the harness on his horses with his back partially turned, doing it with the slow, thorough attention of a man who trusts equipment more than events. He was taller than she'd expected from his letters, which was ridiculous, because letters don't communicate height, and built like a man who had spent 20 years lifting things that were too heavy, and had simply adapted. Dark coat, worn hat, the kind of posture that doesn't come from good breeding, but from years of carrying the weight of a place on your shoulders. He didn't come to her. She walked to him. "Mr. Rusk," she said. He turned. His eyes were gray, or close to it, with a kind of directness that some people find rude and others find honest. He looked at her the way he had probably looked at every piece of equipment he'd ever purchased, not unkindly, but assessing. Checking what he was actually getting versus what had been described. "Miss Blythe," he said. That was all. He picked up her trunk without asking and loaded it into the wagon without fanfare. He climbed onto the seat. He waited. She climbed up beside him. They drove out of Red Willow Crossing without a word exchanged between them. Behind her, she heard the woman with the broom say something to someone else, and then a laugh, low and knowing. She didn't turn around. She would learn later what the town already knew, that 9 women had made this same drive up the mountain, that the longest any of them had lasted was 11 days. That 2 had sent letters back to town from the ranch asking if someone could come get them. That one, a woman named Clarissa Prentice from Meadow Fork, had walked down the mountain on her own with her trunk balanced on a borrowed handcart rather than spend another night in that house. She would learn all of that later. For now, there was only the sound of the wagon wheels, the cold coming off the high ground, and the man beside her who drove with both hands and said absolutely nothing for an hour and 40 minutes. She counted. The first thing she said was not a pleasantry. "How many head do you run?" He glanced at her sideways. A brief thing, then back to the road. 230, near the end of summer. "Lost 7 this past season, to predators or weather?" Another sideways glance, slightly longer this time. "Weather, mostly. 1 to a bad crossing at the upper creek." "Do you have a dog?" 2. "Are they any good?" "Good enough." She nodded, looked out at the ridgeline. "Your letter said the north fence needed work before winter." "It does. Is there someone who comes to help with that? Or is it your work alone?" He was quiet for a moment. Not an uncomfortable quiet, more like a man who didn't answer questions he hadn't finished thinking about. "Mine, generally. I can hire men from town when the work requires it." "But you don't prefer to." It wasn't a question. He didn't answer it as one. "No," he said. "I don't." She let that sit. She had learned slowly and at some personal cost that not every silence needed to be filled. The world was full of people who talked to cover the fact that they weren't thinking. She had been one of them once, when she was younger and more afraid of what quiet revealed about a room. She wasn't anymore. By the time the ridge came into view through the timber, the ranch house, and the outbuildings sitting on a wide natural bench above the valley, gray-weathered wood and a stone chimney, and 2 corrals, she had formed her first real impression of Calder Rusk. Not cold, not cruel, careful. There was a difference, and it mattered more than most people realized. The house was exactly what his letter had described, and she gave him credit for that. It was clean, exceptionally clean, in the way that a place gets clean when someone has spent years trying to control what they could control, and the house was the easiest thing to control. The floors were swept, the kitchen was ordered, the woodbox was stacked with precision. But the rooms had the quality of spaces that had been maintained, rather than lived in the kind of cleanliness that comes not from care for the place, but from discipline applied to it. There were 2 chairs at the kitchen table, not 3, not 4-2, and they were positioned with exactly the distance from the table as though measured. There were no curtains on the windows. The glass was clean, but the frames were bare. There was a list on the wall near the door, household schedule. Meal times, when water was drawn, when the lamps were trimmed. It was written in the same blunt hand as his letter, and it was specific enough that she initially assumed it was meant for a ranch hand. It was not for a ranch hand. She read it without expression, and then set down her traveling bag and looked around the kitchen once more. She was not horrified. She was not amused. She was, if she was honest, cataloging. Calder stood near the doorway, watching her read the list. His expression, if it could be called that, was the expression of a man who has presented something and is now waiting to see what happens, not anxiously, not hopefully, but with the flat patience of someone who already knows how this particular scene ends. "The bedroom is through there," he said. "You'll have it." "I sleep in the back room. Separate," she said. "That was my intent." "Good." She turned from the list. "And the schedule, is this what you expect me to follow?" He held her gaze. "It's what works for the ranch. Some of it will need adjusting once I understand the rhythms better." A pause. "The schedule is what works for the ranch," she finished. "I heard you, and I'm not arguing with it. I'm telling you that schedules adjust over time when two people are running a household together instead of one person running it alone." "That's not a complaint, Mr. Rusk. That's just how things work." He looked at her for a long, level moment. He said nothing. He walked out to the barn. She stood alone in the kitchen for the space of 3 full breaths. Then she hung up her coat, located the wood stove's draft lever, and started making dinner with what was available, because whatever else was uncertain about this arrangement, a cold dinner wasn't going to make anything better. He came back in at 6, which matched the schedule on the wall. He sat at the table. She served 2 plates. She sat across from him. The food was plain, but it was hot, and it was seasoned properly, which was more than he apparently expected, because he ate the entire plate without stopping, and then looked up as though he had just remembered he was supposed to say something. "Good," he said. "Thank you." He stood. He carried his plate to the wash basin. He set it in. He walked toward the back room. "Rusk," she said. He stopped. "I'd like to know what's most broken before winter hits hard. In order of priority, if you have one." He stood with his back to her for a moment. Then he turned partway. "North window seals are going. Cold comes in along the east wall, something terrible. The kitchen door doesn't hang right, lets in a draft. The stovepipe in the back needs cleaning or it'll back up." She nodded. "I'll start with the windows." He looked at her. "You know how to do that." "I do." He stood there another moment in that particular way. He had not shifting, not fidgeting, just standing absolutely still while he finished whatever internal process he was running. Then he said, "All right," and went to bed. She sat at the table alone with her tea, and the sound of the wind starting up outside, and the single lamp throwing yellow light across the spotless, lifeless kitchen. 9 women had sat here, maybe, or in the front room. Or they'd gone straight to bed without the tea. 9 women had eventually decided they couldn't stay. She thought about that. She turned the idea over the way you turn a stone in your hand, feeling for the weight of it, trying to understand the shape. She wasn't them. She didn't say that with any smugness. She genuinely didn't know yet whether she could stay either, not in any deep sense of knowing. She only knew that nothing she had seen so far frightened her. The schedule on the wall, the bare windows, the 2 chairs, the man who ate without speaking and went to bed without saying good night. None of it frightened her. It made her tired, in a way the kind of tired you feel when you recognize a complicated situation, know it's going to take time and patience, not cleverness. But fear was different from tiredness, and she had learned not to confuse the two. She finished her tea. She washed both plates. She put another log on the fire, because the east wall was exactly as cold as he'd said, and went to bed. Outside, the wind came down off the high ridge and pushed against the house, looking, as mountain wind always does, for the places where things weren't sealed tight. She had already started making a list. By the end of the 3rd day, she had sealed the north windows with strips of flannel cloth and heated tallow, rehung the kitchen door on its upper hinge so it sat flush in the frame, and located the old curtains that had been folded and stored in a cedar chest under the spare room bed gray wool, heavy enough to keep the cold out, packed away so long that the cedar smell had worked all the way through the fibers. She hung them without asking. She heard him stop in the doorway when he came in from the afternoon feeding. She kept her back to him, smoothing the edge of the last panel over its rod. He stood there for what felt like a long time. "Those were my mother's," he said. His voice was the same as always, flat even, giving nothing away. She turned. I know, I found them in the cedar chest. They're good heavy wool, too good to stay packed away. His expression didn't change, but something around his eyes did a tightening brief and quickly controlled, like a door that opened an inch and was pulled shut again from the inside. Do what you like, he said, and went to wash up for supper. She turned back to the curtain and finished smoothing it. She filed that moment away. The cedar chest, the folded curtains. The expression he'd had for 1 second before he locked it down. She was beginning to understand the architecture of this man. Not the surface of him, the surface was exactly what it appeared to be, hard and ordered and spare. She was starting to see the structure underneath, the load-bearing walls, so to speak. The places where something heavy had been pressing for a very long time. She didn't push on any of it. Not yet. She served supper. He ate. He said good again, which she was starting to recognize as his version of a compliment, and this time she didn't just say thank you. She said, "There's a recipe I'd like to try with the dried apples in the pantry, if you don't mind the extra fuel for the oven." He looked up. "Try it," he said, small, so small it barely counted. But she counted it anyway. On the 5th day she found him. She hadn't meant to. She had gone around the far side of the barn to check on a gap in the siding she'd noticed from the kitchen window old boards, shrinking with age, and the kind of gap that becomes a real problem when the temperature drops below 0. She came around the corner quietly because the ground was soft from yesterday's frost and her boots didn't make much sound, and she stopped. Calder was crouched in the hay at the back corner of the barn, beside a calf that couldn't have been more than a few weeks old. The calf was shivering despite the blanket laid over it, and its eyes had that glassy look that means an animal is frightened and sick at once and isn't sure which feeling is winning. Calder was talking to it, not the way a man talks to livestock when he needs it to move or calm down short-clipped commands, the language of management. He was talking to it the way you'd talk to something you cared about. Low and unhurried, the words themselves secondary to the tone, which was the softest thing she had ever heard from him. His large, rough hand was moving in slow circles along the calf's neck, and the animal's breathing was steadying, slowly, in response. She stood very still. She wasn't hiding, exactly. She simply didn't move, because some moments you don't interrupt. He talked to that calf for another 3 minutes or so, patient and quiet, until the shivering eased and the animal dropped its head against his knee with the particular exhausted trust of something that has decided it's safe. Then Calder looked up. He saw her. The softness went off his face like a light being extinguished. Not anger, he wasn't angry. But the shutters came down so completely and so fast that she would have doubted what she'd seen if she hadn't been watching his hands, which were still moving in those slow circles, because he hadn't thought to stop them yet. "Siding's got a gap on the south corner," she said, keeping her voice even. "About 3 fingers wide. I can get to it tomorrow if you tell me where the patchboards are." He stared at her. "Lean to behind the tack room," he said. "Thank you." She turned and walked back the way she came. She waited until she was around the corner and entirely out of his sight before she let herself breathe. There it was. That was what 9 women had not stayed long enough to see. Not cruelty, not indifference, not even coldness, not really just armor. Layers of it built up over years by someone who had learned that showing tenderness was the same as showing a target. A man who talked to frightened calves in the back of a barn where no one was supposed to see him do it. She walked back to the house. She put the kettle on. She sat down at the kitchen table with 2 chairs, and the schedule on the wall, and the curtains she'd hung without asking. She wasn't going anywhere. She just needed him to understand that. And understanding, for a man like Calder Rusk, wasn't going to come from being told. It was going to come from time, and she had decided, somewhere on the floor of that barn, without meaning to, that she had enough time to give him. The morning of her 6th day on Ironpine Ridge, Lenora woke before the lamp was needed and lay still for a moment in the dark, listening to the house. It made sounds, this house. Different sounds than a town building, It's not the creak of floorboards from neighbors above, not the distant clatter of a street coming alive at dawn, but the sounds of something large and wooden pressed against weather. The east wall ticked and groaned where the cold worked at it. The roof timbers settled. The stovepipe in the back room the one Calder had mentioned needed cleaning gave a low, occasional knock, like something trapped inside it trying to get out. She had lived in enough places to know that a house tells you things if you're quiet enough to listen. This one was telling her it was tired, not broken. Not past saving, just tired in the way that things get tired when they've been maintained without being loved when someone has kept the function going, but let the feeling go. She got up, started the stove, and began the day. Calder was already out. He was always already out. She had not yet caught him at breakfast, not once in 6 days, and she had decided not to make an issue of it because some battles tell you more about yourself than they do about the other person, and this one wasn't worth fighting yet. She ate alone. She cleaned up. She made a plate and left it on the back of the stove where it would stay warm, and every morning it was gone when she came back in from her own morning work, and not once had he mentioned it. She had decided that was its own kind of conversation. She pulled on her coat and her heaviest pair of gloves and went out to the gap she'd identified yesterday on the south side of the barn. The patchboards were exactly where he'd said they'd be, in the lean-to behind the tack room, and she sorted through them until she found 2 pieces that would do the job. She carried them around and stood looking at the gap, gauging the angle, figuring out in her head how she was going to hold a board in place and drive a nail at the same time when the boards were at shoulder height and her arms were not, in fact, 6 feet long. She was still working out the geometry of it when she heard boots behind her. She didn't turn around. She already knew his walk. "I was going to get to that," Calder said. "I know," she said. "I'm getting to it first." He came around beside her and looked at the gap. He stood there the way he always stood, absolutely still, taking in information before he committed to anything. Then he held out his hand. She looked at it, then at the boards. Then she handed him one. They worked in silence for 20 minutes. He held, she drove the first nails, then she held while he drove the rest, because his arms were in fact the right length and the work went faster. Neither of them said anything about the arrangement. Neither of them remarked on how naturally it had fallen into place. When the last nail was in, Calder pressed his palm flat against the new board and pushed, checking the hold. "Good," he said, and walked back toward the corral. She stood there with the hammer in her hand and felt something she hadn't expected, not warmth, exactly, and not satisfaction either, but something in the neighborhood of both. The feeling of a single piece clicking into position inside something much larger and still mostly unmapped. She went back inside to start the midday preparations. The question of the curtains didn't come up again directly. But 2 days after she'd hung them, she noticed that Calder had begun sitting at the table a few minutes longer after supper before going to his back room. Not much longer, 5 minutes, maybe 10. He didn't initiate conversation during those minutes. He drank his coffee and looked at the table or the window, and she went about the business of cleaning up, and the silence between them was the same quality of silence it had always been, except that there was more of it, which meant he was choosing to be in the room instead of escaping to the room, and she understood the difference even if she didn't say so. On the 9th day, she asked him about the ranch ledger. She asked because she'd found it on the shelf while looking for a box of matches, and she'd noticed, in the brief moment before she put it back, that the columns were meticulous, but that several entries had been noted and then crossed out with single lines, which usually meant a decision reconsidered or a cost that had shifted. She wasn't prying. She simply wanted to understand what she'd walked into. "I'd like to look at the ledger," she said at supper. He looked up from his plate. "Why?" "Because I'm managing this household, and I don't know what I have to work with. I don't know what you spend on provisions versus what you grow or keep. I don't know when the lean months hit hardest. I'd rather know now than find out the hard way in February." He chewed. set his fork down, picked up his coffee. Most women don't ask about the ledger. I'm aware, she said. Most women also didn't stay past 11 days. Something passed across his face. Not quite humor. Something drier than that, the kind of expression a person makes when they've been caught saying something honest without meaning to. He stood up and got the ledger from the shelf and set it on the table beside her plate. After supper, he said, "Thank you." He sat back down and they finished eating in the same silence as always, except that the ledger sat there between them like a thing that had been acknowledged, and that was different from before. After supper, she read through it while he sat in his chair on the far side of the table with his coffee going cold and watched her, not hovering, not crowding her, just present in the room. She asked 3 questions. He answered all 3. She pointed out a supply cost that looked high compared to the others, and he told her why, and she nodded. She closed the ledger and slid it back across the table. "You're short on lamp oil going into winter," she said. "And the provision estimate for January looks light for 2 people. You'd written it for 1. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "I'd planned for the possibility that it would still just be 1. She met his eyes. I know, he didn't look away. She didn't either. The stove crackled once, sharply. Outside, the wind moved through the pines on the upper slope with the sound of something large breathing. "I'll adjust it," he said. "I'll go into Red Willow Crossing with you next time you go." "I know what to buy." A pause, all right. He took his cup to the back room. She sat with the lamp for a while longer and felt the significance of what had just happened settle quietly into the bones of the evening. He had written the provision estimate for 1. He had been so certain she would leave, so prepared for it, so adapted to it, that he had not even adjusted the numbers for her presence. She thought about 9 women and what that kind of repeated leaving does to a person. Not all at once, not dramatically, but slowly, the way cold gets into a house, not through one large breach, but through all the small ones you stopped bothering to seal, because what was the point? She turned down the lamp and went to bed. She did not sleep for a while. The day she understood Calder Rusk was not the day she'd seen him with the calf, though that had started it. It was an ordinary Tuesday, 2 weeks in, when the sky was the color of old pewter and the temperature had dropped 8 degrees since morning, and she was in the middle of repairing a seam on one of the heavy wool blankets when Calder came into the kitchen. In the middle of the afternoon, which he never did. He poured himself coffee. He stood at the window. He drank. "She kept sewing. After a while," he said, without turning from the window, "lost another calf last night. The spotted one. She set down the blanket. The sick one from the barn?" "Yes, I'm sorry." He didn't respond to that. People who aren't used to condolences sometimes don't know what to do with them. They bounce off like stones off iron. She'd learned not to take it personally. "Was it the cold or the illness?" she asked. "Both, probably." He drank his coffee. "I should have moved it to the house 2 days ago." "I knew it was going the wrong direction." "But you didn't." "No." She picked up the blanket again. "Why not?" He turned from the window then, and she kept her eyes on her sewing because she'd found that Calder said more when he didn't feel watched. "It's a working ranch," he said. "You don't bring sick animals into the house. That's the rule. Your rule. A sensible rule, it might be," she said. "But you're the one who made it, which means you're also the one who followed it when you probably didn't want to. And now you're standing so by a kitchen in the middle of the afternoon, carrying it around like something heavy." He stared at her. She looked up. He was looking at her with the specific expression of a man who has been accurately described without his permission. Not angry, something rawer than anger. "I'm not criticizing you," she said. "I'm just saying I notice." He set his cup down. He walked back to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame, not looking back. "The spotted one was the one from the back corner," he said. "The one he'd been talking to. The one that had stopped shivering against his knee." "I know," she said quietly. He went out. She finished the seam. She stayed at the table for a long time afterward, not sewing, just thinking. This was the part nobody from Red Willow Crossing could see. This was the interior of a man who had spent so long keeping everything at arm's length that even his grief counts sideways, disguised as practicality, dressed up as the sensible application of sensible rules. A man who didn't say, "I cared about that animal," a man who said, "I should have moved it sooner," which was the same sentence with all the feeling translated into blame, all the softness converted into fault, because fault was easier to carry than grief. She had known men like that. She had loved one briefly, before she understood the shape of that kind of pain. The difference was that Calder's version of it didn't hurt anyone but himself. She made an extra portion at supper that night. He didn't comment on it. He ate every bite. The storm came on a Thursday in late November, and it came fast. She had seen weather building for 2 days, the quality of light in the afternoons going wrong, the particular restlessness that comes into animals before the pressure changes, the way the temperature dropped and kept dropping without the usual recovery at midday. She had doubled the wood inside, restocked the kitchen stores, filled every water vessel she could find, and checked the seals on all the windows she'd repaired. Calder had watched her do all of this without comment. She wasn't sure if that meant he approved or if he simply had no basis for comparison. The storm arrived around 11 at night. She heard it hit the north side of the house like something with intention, not the gradual build of ordinary winter wind, but the sudden, wall-solid force of a mountain storm that has been gathering altitude for 2 days and finally arrived at its target. The windows she'd sealed held. The door she'd rehung stayed tight. The curtains moved slightly, but only slightly. She got up and put more wood on the stove and sat down to wait. Calder was awake too. She heard him moving in the back room, heard the specific knock of a boot on a wooden floor, heard him come out and check the stovepipe and then stand in the kitchen for a moment. "Windows are holding," she said from the table. He looked at her. She had lit the small lamp, just enough to see by. He stood in the doorway to his room in his shirt and trousers, hair not yet pressed flat by a hat, which was the most undone she'd seen him, and for a disorienting second she was reminded that he was a person who existed when no one was looking, which sounds obvious, but which she had sometimes forgotten over the past weeks, when he had seemed so thoroughly constructed for the purpose of remaining opaque. "I know they are," he said, but he didn't go back to his room. He came and sat down at the table across from her, the way he sat at mealtimes, except there was no meal. They sat. The storm hit the house in waves. Between the waves, there was a strange, pressurized silence where the snow was simply falling straight down and you could almost hear each individual flake. "Did the previous winters take much?" she asked, meaning the ranch, the animals, the structures. "Some lost part of the hay storage roof 3 winters back. Rebuilt it myself." He paused. "Lost 6 head in the storm the year before that. Cold came on faster than I'd banked for. Were you here alone both times?" He looked at her. "I'm always here alone." She held that. "That's a lot of weight for one person," she said. He didn't answer immediately. He looked at the lamp instead. "You get used to it. You get used to it, or you just stop noticing it." The silence after that was different from the other silences. Not the silence of a man who had nothing to say, the silence of a man who had been asked something he hadn't been asked before and didn't know yet where the answer was. "My father was the same way," he said. It came out slower than his usual speech, like something being lifted carefully. "After my mother left." He stopped. She waited. He just went inside himself and kept working. Like if he worked enough, what was missing wouldn't matter. He looked at his hands. "I watched him do that for 10 years. How old were you when she left?" 7. 7. She let that sit without filling it. She didn't like the mountain, he said. Said it was too far from everything, too cold, too quiet. Said she felt like she was disappearing up here. He paused. She went back east and sent 2 letters after, and then nothing. "And your father?" Worked himself into an early grave at 53 and never mentioned her name again. He picked up his coffee cup, then set it back down because it was empty. "I don't say that like it's sad. It just is what it was." It's both, she said simply. He looked at her. It can just be what it was and also be sad, she said. Those aren't two different things. He didn't answer. But he didn't leave the table either. And outside, the storm pressed against the house, and inside the lamp burned down slowly, and Lenora sat across from Calder Rusk and understood, finally and completely, the full blueprint of what she was dealing with. Not a cold man, not an unfeeling one. A man who had learned, at 7 years old, from the most formative source available, that loving someone who could leave meant you would eventually be alone in a cold house on a mountain with no explanation and no letters. A man who had watched his father's response to that lesson and absorbed it completely, unknowingly, the way children absorb everything they see when they're young enough that observation and education are the same thing. A man who had built a life specifically designed to confirm what he already believed that people leave, that wanting them to stay was foolish, that the correct response to the possibility of loss was to make sure there was nothing to lose in the first place. And 9 women had come to this house and left, one after another, and every single departure had been one more proof of the thing he'd believed since he was 7 years old. She didn't say any of this to him. It wasn't the moment for it, and she'd learned that saying the right thing at the wrong moment was just as useless as saying the wrong thing. She filed it away instead, the way she'd been filing things away since the first evening, building a map of him piece by piece. You should get some sleep, she said. The storm will probably peak before dawn, and you'll want to check the fence line first light. He looked at her as though she'd said something unexpected, and then he looked at the table, and she could almost see him deciding something she didn't know what. Couldn't read it fully. But something shifted in the set of his shoulders. Yeah, he said. He stood. Wake me if something comes in wrong. I will. He went back to his room. She sat with the lamp for another hour while the storm did what storms do, and thought about a 7-year-old boy watching his mother climb down off a mountain with her trunks, and a father who turned his face to the work and never turned it back. She thought about what it cost a person, that kind of learning. How deep it went, how long it took to even recognize it was there. And then she thought about something else, something practical, which was her way of returning herself to solid ground when the thinking got too large for the room. She thought about the provision estimate he'd written for one person. She went and found the ledger and changed it herself quietly, in pencil, before she went back to bed. The storm lasted 31 hours. When it broke, Ironpine Ridge was buried under 2 feet of new snow with drifts against the north barn wall that reached the eave. The sky came out the other side of the storm, pale and sharp and completely clear, the way high mountain sky gets after heavy weather, almost offensive in its brightness. Calder was out before light, checking what the storm had taken. She had coffee hot when he came back in at 7:30, his coat solid white on the shoulders, his expression the particular kind of tight that meant the news wasn't good but hadn't reached disaster. North Fence took it, he said, pulling off his gloves. 2 sections, maybe 3. Hard to tell where the post line is under the drift. The herd, sheltered in the timber on the south slope, mostly. I need to ride the upper pasture and count. She poured his coffee and set it on the table. She sat down with her own. What do you need to do first, and what can I do that frees you up to do it? He looked at her across the table with the steam rising from his cup, and this was the particular look he gave her, sometimes the one she still hadn't fully translated, that lay somewhere between confusion and something that had no clean name. Like a man looking at a map of a country he'd been told didn't exist. Get the barn animals fed and watered, he said. I'll saddle up and ride the upper pasture. When I'm back, I'll know what the fence actually needs and whether I have to bring men up from town. All right, the bay mare's got a sore foot. Don't let her put full weight on the left front if you can avoid it. Got it. He drank half his coffee standing up and went back out. She tied her coat, found the heaviest pair of work gloves, and went to the barn. The mare's foot was worse than sore. She'd taken a stone bruise, probably before the storm, and the swelling had set in during the cold. Lenora packed it the way her father had taught her, with the clay and linseed mixture you keep on hand exactly for this reason, and wrapped it in clean flannel and left the mare in the far stall with fresh hay and a bucket of warm water. She fed and watered everything else, checked for ice in the water troughs, and broke it where it had formed. Counted the chickens twice because 2 seemed to be missing, and then found them both pressed into the corner behind the feed sacks, alive and deeply unhappy. She carried them back to the coop and latched it properly. She came back in, changed her gloves, and started on the midday meal early because she had a feeling the day was going to run long. She was right. Calder came back at noon with snow to his knee and an expression she hadn't seen before, the expression of a man who has been carrying a problem by himself for so long that the problem has started to feel like his fault. He told her the fence situation was worse than he'd thought. 3 sections down, a 4th bent so badly that the posts would need to come out and go back in, and a portion of the upper pasture still unaccounted for because the drifts were chest-high on his horse in the narrowest section, and he'd had to turn back. "I'll have to get 2 men up from town," he said. He did not say this with any expression. He said it the way a person says something they find shameful but know is necessary. She put a plate in front of him. He sat. "When can they get up here?" she asked. "If I send word today and the road's passable by morning day after tomorrow, maybe. Then you've got today and tomorrow to get the worst of it done yourself, so the men from town can finish what's left." She sat across from him. "Eat first." He looked at his plate. He ate. And then, between bites, in the halting and sideways fashion that had become the language she and Calder Rusk used for everything that actually mattered, he said, "The previous woman, the last one. Before you, she left because I told her a storm was coming and she needed to stay inside, and she didn't understand why I couldn't just talk to her instead of going out to work, and He stopped. Moved his fork. "I didn't explain it right." Lenora waited. "I don't explain things right," he said. "It came out even. Factual, like an entry in a ledger. This is a deficit. This is a known quantity, it has been noted." "You explain things fine," she said. "You just don't explain them early enough." He looked up. "You told me the windows were cold. The door hung wrong. The stovepipe needed cleaning. The north fence was the priority. You told me where the patchboards were. You told me about the mare's foot this morning." She kept her voice plain, just stating the facts back to him. "You explain practical things. It's the other kind you hold back." He chewed, swallowed, said nothing. "That's not a character flaw," she said. "It's a habit. Habits change." He stared at her for long enough that she felt the weight of it. Then he looked back at his plate and said, very quietly, as though testing whether the words could hold their own weight, "Most people don't stick around long enough to notice the difference." She let that sentence live in the room for a moment before she answered. "I know," she said. "That's why you're still expecting me to leave." He didn't deny it. He finished his meal. He pushed his chair back and looked at her with the gray, direct eyes that still gave away less than almost any eyes she'd seen, and said, "I need to get back out to the fence." "I know. I'll be late. I'll keep supper warm." He stood. He put on his coat. He stopped at the door not for long, just a second, just a beat, and then he went out. She sat with her own plate for a while after he left. Outside, she could hear the sound of him moving through the snow toward the barn, the creak of the barn door, the muffled sound of a horse being saddled in the quiet that follows a storm. She sat and listened to all of it and thought about what he'd said. Most people don't stick around long enough to notice the difference. She had been right that first night with her tea at the bare kitchen table. He wasn't cold. He had simply spent so many years building a life where people left that he had become genuinely surprised, down in the unspeakable places where a person keeps their truest reactions when someone didn't. She was surprising him. She intended to keep doing it. She cleared the plates, put another log on the fire, checked the lamp oil, and started on the bread she'd been planning to make all week because February was going to be long and flour kept better baked than raw. and she was the kind of person who prepared for February and November because the alternative was scrambling in February. And she had done enough scrambling in her life to know she didn't like how it felt. The afternoon went to dusk. Dusk went to dark. She kept the lamp on the table and the stove at an even heat, and the bread came out better than she'd expected, which was occasionally how things went when you stopped trying to control them and just did the work. Calder came in at 7:30, late enough that she'd started to weigh the practical options, whether to go out with a lamp, whether to assume he was simply still working and trust him to come in when the work was done, whether to stand in the doorway and look up the ridge toward where she could see lantern light moving in the dark like something trying to signal. She had been doing the last of those when she heard his boots on the porch step. He came in with the snow crust on him again, hands too cold for his gloves to have done much good, face drawn tight with the specific exhaustion of a person who has been working in brutal cold for 9 straight hours. She put his plate in front of him. She put his coffee beside it. She sat. He ate without speaking for a while. She didn't push. She had learned his hunger was deeper than food. On bad days, it was a whole body thing, the depletion that happens when you've burned everything, keeping yourself upright, and you don't always have language for it when you get back inside. Got the worst section done, he said finally. The 4th section will need the post-work, which is the 2-man job. Rest of it should hold until the men can get up here. Good. He drank his coffee. He looked at the bread she'd left on the board. She cut him a slice without being asked. He ate it. He sat back. He looked at the curtains in the window, his mother's curtains, the gray wool ones, moving slightly in the residual warmth coming off the stove. She would have been practical, he said. She didn't ask who. Did you take after her? I don't know. I was 7. People take after who they were around, she said. Before 7, you were around her. After 7, you were around your father. He thought about that. He was practical, he said. Then maybe the practical part is from both of them, she said. He was quiet a long time, long enough that the fire settled in the stove and the ridge outside the window went from black to the deep blue that snow-covered high ground gets under a clear winter sky, lit from below by its own reflecting surface. I became exactly like him, Calder said. I didn't mean to. I didn't even notice when it happened. She held that. Most people become exactly like the person they watched most carefully at the age when they needed someone to watch, she said. It's not a choice. It's just what happens. He looked at her directly. Does that mean it can't change? She met his eyes. No, she said. It doesn't mean that at all. He dropped his gaze to the table. He sat for another minute. Then he stood, carried his plate to the wash basin, set it in, and walked to the back room. Doorway. She looked up. The bread, he said, is the best thing I've eaten in maybe 3 years. He went to bed. She sat at the table a while longer, in the kitchen that had started to feel, incrementally and imperfectly and without any drama whatsoever, like a place where 2 people lived instead of 1 man and a schedule on a wall. She was tired in the bones, the good kind of tired, the kind that comes from a day that asked something of you and got it. She turned down the lamp. She went to bed. And on Ironpine Ridge, under a sky full of stars that the storm had scrubbed clean, the house that had been cold for so long began quietly, without announcement, to hold a different kind of warmth. The 2 men from Red Willow Crossing arrived on a Friday morning, 3 days after the storm, riding up the mountain road on horses that clearly would have preferred to be somewhere else. Lenora saw them from the kitchen window, a big man she didn't know named Garrett, who had the hands of someone who'd done fence work his entire life, and a younger one, barely past 20, who introduced himself as Dell and immediately looked around the ranch yard with the particular expression of a person calculating how fast they could get back down the mountain. She had coffee and bread on the table for them before Calder brought them in. Garrett took off his hat and nodded at her. Ma'am. He said it with a directness she liked no performance in it, just acknowledgement. Dell looked at the curtains in the windows. He looked at the food on the table. He looked at Lenora and then at Calder, and then back at the table, and she could see the exact moment when he revised whatever story he'd been told about this ranch by whoever had been telling it. Calder sat at the table and explained the fence situation without preamble. 3 sections down, one needing post replacement, the upper pasture access still partially blocked by drift. He laid it out in the same order. Thorough way, he did everything priority by priority. Practical need first. No wasted words. Garrett listened with his coffee cup held in both hands and nodded twice. Dell wrote nothing down and seemed to be paying less attention than was ideal, which Lenora filed away. The post replacement is the part that needs 2, Calder said. Rest of it I can work alongside you. Road coming up was soft in the middle section, Garrett said. If we get more weather before we finish, we're not getting back down. I know, Calder said. We move fast. They went out. Lenora cleared the cups and watched through the window as the 3 of them crossed toward the barn, Calder in front, Garrett a half step behind, Dell lagging in a way that probably meant something about how the day was going to go. She was right about Dell by noon. Calder came in for the midday meal with his jaw set in a way she'd learned to read not anger, exactly. It's more the expression of a man who is doing sustained internal arithmetic about how to accomplish twice the work with 3/4 of the expected help. He said nothing about it. He ate fast, asked her where she'd put the extra wire she'd found in the back of the tack room, and went back out. She found him at the far section of the north fence an hour later, when she brought out coffee in the covered pot and the extra set of gloves she'd noticed Garrett's left hand needed. Dell was working the easy section, restapling wire to existing posts. Garrett and Calder were at the hard part, the section where 2 posts had snapped at ground level and needed to come out of frozen earth, which is the kind of work that requires either 2 strong men or 1 strong man, and a great deal of patience, and they were making it work but barely. She set the coffee down on the flat rock that served as a work surface and looked at the broken post situation. If you angle the bar under the root rather than straight down, she said to Calder, the frozen ground will give more. He looked at her. He looked at the post. He repositioned the pry bar. The post came up in 2 pulls. Garrett looked at her with an expression that mixed surprise and respect in equal amounts. Where'd you learn fence work? My father had 200 acres in the valley and 1 farmhand who was reliable about half the time, she said. You learn or you don't eat. Garrett laughed, a short, genuine sound. Even Calder's mouth moved slightly at the corner, which was, in her experience of the past several weeks, the closest he got to a laugh in front of other people. Dell came over for coffee and didn't go back to his section until Garrett said his name twice. By late afternoon, the post replacement was done. The worst sections were repaired, and what remained was the 4th section that would take another half-day's work and could wait until morning. Garrett said they'd bunk in the barn if that was acceptable, and Lenora said it was more than acceptable and that supper would be ready at 6, and there was more than enough. At 6, the 4 of them sat at the kitchen table. She'd pulled the bench from the back porch to make enough seating and ate the beef stew she'd had going since midday, and the bread from yesterday warmed in the oven, and the preserved plum conserve she'd found at the back of the pantry shelf that turned out to be 2 years old, but was still perfectly good. She watched Calder at the table with other people for the first time. It was instructive. He ate without contributing to the conversation, which was mostly Garrett talking about the season's conditions, and Dell complaining about the cold in the specific way that young men complain about things when they want to seem tougher than they are. But Calder wasn't absent from the meal the way he was sometimes absent from their evenings, that quality of physical presence combined with deliberate interior distance. He was listening. She could tell by the way his eyes tracked between Garrett and the table, the slight adjustments he made to his posture when something said required him to consider it. When Garrett mentioned that the Halverson operation 3 miles east had lost a significant portion of their winter hay in the same storm, Calder set his fork down. How much, he said. Barn roof and 2/3 of what was in it, Garrett said. Old man Halverson's not saying much about it, but the math is bad for them. Calder was quiet for a moment. I've got overage in the south loft. More than I need. Garrett looked at him. You offering? I'm saying I have it, Calder said. Lenora kept her eyes on her own plate. She knew what she'd just heard. She knew he didn't want it named. I'll let Halverson know someone on the ridge has hay going spare, Garrett said, with the specific tact of a man who understood the language being used. He can send a man to negotiate. No negotiation needed, Calder said. Just tell him to send a wagon. Garrett nodded. Dell looked between them and seemed not entirely sure what had just happened. Lenora cut another piece of bread and put it on Dell's plate because he'd been eating at the rate of a man who hadn't seen food in several days, and a person could disapprove of his work ethic and still recognize he was hungry. After supper, Garrett helped her clear the plates he just did it, without being asked, picking up what he could carry and setting it in the wash basin, which was the action of a man raised right, and she thanked him plainly. Dell fell asleep in his chair and then startled awake and went to the barn with the dignity of someone, pretending he hadn't just been asleep. Calder stayed at the table. She washed the plates with her back to him, and there was a long silence. And then he said, Garrett's a good man. I can see that, she said. Known him 15 years. He's never said an unnecessary word about my business. She turned around. He was looking at the table. You mean what Garrett knows about the arrangement up here, she said. About the women who came before. He met her eyes briefly. Yes. Does it bother you that people know? He was quiet. It bothers me that they think they know what it means. She dried her hands on the cloth. What does it mean? He shifted in his chair. This was the particular restlessness he showed when a conversation moved into territory he hadn't pre-surveyed and didn't have language ready for not discomfort with her, she'd decided, but discomfort with the words themselves, with the fact that some things apparently had no ready-made housing in him. It means I'm difficult to live with, he said. Is that what you think? What the evidence shows. Or, she said, sitting back down across from him, it means you picked up a way of living that works for one person and never adjusted it. And women who came here expecting to be invited into something found instead that they were expected to fit around something. That's different from being difficult. He looked at her. That's a fine distinction, he said. Most important distinctions are fine ones, she said. He sat with that. Outside, she heard Garrett's voice saying something low, and even to Dell out in the barn. And then nothing. The ridge was the particular quiet of a clear night after snow, which is the quietest kind of quiet there is. You could have said that to me at any point, he said. The first week. You wouldn't have heard it in the first week, she said. He thought about that long enough that she went and put the kettle on, and when she brought the tea, he was still in the same position, still thinking. She set a cup in front of him and sat back down and waited. No, he said, I wouldn't have. The next morning, the fence work was finished before noon. Garrett shook Calder's hand at the end of it, a real handshake, the kind that means something. He nodded at Lenora. He told Dell to get on his horse, and Dell got on his horse, and they rode off down the mountain road with the particular briskness of men who had a warmer elevation waiting for them. Calder stood in the yard watching them go. Lenora stood beside him, not close. Just beside, the way you stand next to someone when you're both looking at the same thing. Road'll be better by tomorrow, he said. Yes, she said. He turned and went to check the repaired sections one more time, because he was the kind of man who checked things more than once, and she went inside. She stood in the kitchen alone and let herself feel briefly the things she had been carefully not feeling for the past several days, the specific precariousness of her own position. Not in the practical sense, she wasn't afraid, she wasn't unhappy, she wasn't planning to leave. But she understood, standing in that kitchen, with the curtains she'd hung, and the ledger she'd annotated, and the bread she'd made, and the plate she warmed for him each morning, and the tea she'd put in front of him the night before, that she had put a very great deal of herself into this place, and this situation, and this man, and that he had not yet said a single word about whether any of it was wanted. Not in those terms, not directly. She was not a woman who required declarations. She had been very clear about that with herself from the beginning, had built her decision to come here on the explicit premise that she did not need warmth and flattery and pretty promises. She had meant that. She still meant it. But there was a space between needing declarations and never needing to know whether you were staying or going. And she had been standing in that space for 5 weeks now, and the not knowing was starting to have a weight to it. She didn't say anything. She started on the afternoon work. But she felt it, and she thought it was important to be honest with herself about the fact that she felt it, because the alternative was the thing she'd done once before. With the man in Harwick, the thing where you're so determined not to need something that you don't notice when you actually do need it. Until you're 6 months past the point where you should have said something, and the shape of things is already set. She was not going to do that again. She would give it a little more time. Much. Just enough. December arrived with a cold that was different in character from November's cold, not the cold of a season establishing itself, but the cold of something committed, something that had settled in for the long run and had no intention of accommodating anyone. The mountain closed around itself. The days shortened to the point where midday light felt provisional, like something borrowed. The road down to Red Willow Crossing was passable but unpleasant, and Calder's trips to town, which had never been frequent, became rarer still. They were, in all practical terms, alone together on Ironpine Ridge. What surprised her was how unalarming she found it. She had wondered, when she'd accepted Calder's terms and bought her ticket and packed her trunk, whether she was the kind of person who could tolerate genuine isolation without losing something of herself, the particular interior noise that some people need in order to know they're still present. She had lived in town all her adult life. She had neighbors, customers, the regular texture of community that you sometimes don't notice until it's gone. On the mountain, she discovered that she was, at bottom, a person who could be quiet. And slowly, so slowly she almost didn't notice it happening, Calder Rusk was becoming less quiet. Not dramatically, not in any way that would have been visible to someone who didn't know the baseline. He still ate most meals in extended silence. He still went to the barn for the morning feeding before she was up. He still had the particular quality of stillness that she had first catalogued as coldness and now understood as the long habit of a man who had learned to take up as little space as possible in case taking up space was an imposition. But he had started talking, small things. He would come in from the morning feeding and mention that one of the horses had seemed off-footed and he was going to watch her for a day before deciding whether to poultice. He would sit down to supper and say that the light had looked a certain way on the upper ridge and he thought more weather was forming to the north. He would stop in the doorway of whatever room she was working in and say something practical and then stand there a moment longer than strictly necessary before moving on, as though he'd found a reason to be in the vicinity and hadn't quite finished with it. She didn't remark on any of it. She just answered him as though it had always been this way, because she understood that pointing at a thing Calder Rusk was doing, that he wasn't accustomed to doing, was the fastest way to make him stop doing it. The evening he talked about his father for the second time, she hadn't prompted it. She was darning a sock. She had found the basket of Calder's unmended things and had worked through it systematically over the past 2 weeks, not making a production of it, and he was at the table with the ranch record book, updating the end-of-month entries. The stove was going. The lamps were lit. The curtains were drawn against the dark outside. He said, without looking up from the book, he made me muck the stalls by myself the day after she left. Didn't say anything about it, just handed me the shovel. She kept her eyes on the sock. How long did you do it alone? Until I was big enough to take on the feeding, too. Maybe 2 years. He didn't hire anyone. For the big work, yes. Not for the day-to-day. He turned a page, made an entry. I think he needed me to be busy, because he was. Because if I was busy, I wasn't asking questions he didn't have answers to. She set the sock down, picked up the next one. Did you ask questions? Pause the first week. After that, I stopped. Why? He looked up from the record book then. He looked at her the way he sometimes did in these moments, with the expression of a man who is surprised to find himself saying what he's saying. Not unpleasantly surprised, just surprised. As though he's discovered a room in a building he thought he knew completely. Because he looked so bad every time I did, he said. I was hurting him. I was 7. I didn't want to hurt him. So I just stopped. She thought about a 7-year-old boy deciding his own questions were a burden, putting them away somewhere, going back to the barn and the shovel and the work that couldn't be asked of anyone else. That was a hard thing to ask of a 7-year-old, she said. He didn't ask it, Calder said. I just did it. You did it because he needed you to, she said. Which is asking it, just without the words. He sat with that. He wasn't a bad man, he said. No, she agreed. He was a broken one. That's different. Calder looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face did the thing it sometimes did not, the shutters closing. The opposite of that, the brief lowering of something that was usually held up by effort. You said that before, he said, about different things. Bad and broken being different. It's a distinction that matters, she said. Bad means there's something wrong with the character. Broken means something happened to the character. They look similar from the outside sometimes. What's the difference for the person who has to live with them? She thought about the man in Harwick. She thought about what she'd learned, hard and slow and at cost. If someone's bad, you leave, she said. If someone's broken, you decide whether you're willing to stay while they figure out how to put things back together. The lamp on the table between them burned steadily. He looked at her across it for long enough that she felt the weight of his looking. And you've decided, he said. It wasn't a question, exactly. It was more like a statement being offered to her to confirm or deny. I've decided, she said. He looked back at the record book. He made 3 more entries, closed it, stood up, carried his cup to the wash basin. Stopped in the doorway to the back room. Lenora, he said. She looked up. He almost never used her name. Thank you for the socks, he said. He went to bed. She sat in the lamplight and felt something unlock in her chest, very quietly, without drama the way ice goes out of a creek in early spring, not all at once, not spectacularly, just a gradual giving way of something that had been holding against the current for a long time. She finished the sock she was darning. She put the basket away. She went to bed, and for the first time since she'd arrived on Ironpine Ridge, she slept through the night without waking once. The second storm of December was worse than the first. She knew it 2 days before it arrived. She knew it because of the animals, the way they bunched against the south fence instead of spreading through the upper pasture the way they did on neutral days. She knew it because of the color of the sky at dusk, that specific greenish cast at the horizon that people who don't watch the sky their whole lives don't know to read. She knew it because Calder had ridden the upper pasture twice in the same day, which he only did when he was worried, and came back the second time with his mouth in a line and his eyes doing the calculation she'd learned to recognize. How bad, she asked when he came in. Worse than last time, he said. And I've got 30 head in the upper north pasture that I was planning to move tomorrow. Move them today. Lights going. He was pulling off his coat, thinking out loud, which was new. He had started doing that in the past few weeks, thinking aloud in her presence instead of presenting her with conclusions already reached. She counted it. If I wait for morning, I might have the road in worse condition and the herd more scattered. So go now, she said. I'll come. He looked at her. You don't need to. 2 people move a herd faster than 1, she said. That's not an opinion. That's arithmetic. Tell me what you need me on. There was the moment, the specific beat that she'd come to recognize, where he decided whether to argue or accept. The moment where the old habit, the one that said do it alone, ask nothing of anyone, need no one, went up against whatever had been slowly changing in him over the past 6 weeks. He said, Take the east side. Keep them off the draw. There's a section of bank that's undercut since the last storm, and I don't want anything near it. Got it. And stay on the bay's right. Her left foot still tender. I know, they went. It was the hardest physical work she'd done since arriving. The cold by late afternoon had reached the kind of temperature that makes you aware of every place your clothing doesn't cover, and the upper north pasture was rougher ground than the lower sections. Old glacial outwash with buried rock and uneven footing that the snow made deceptive. The herd, 32 head, she counted them twice, were nervous with the weather coming. Not cooperative. The kind of collective animal energy that transmits through a group and makes each individual worse than they would be alone. She held the east side. She made mistakes. The base spooked at something under the snow, and she lost 30 feet on the flank before she got her back under control, and 3 animals peeled off toward the draw before she could intercept them, and she had a moment, a real moment, of genuine alarm where the bank Calder had warned her about was closer than she wanted, and 2 cows were moving toward it with the purposeless determination of animals that don't know they're in danger. She did not freeze. She cut across the slope at an angle, taking the risk of her own footing to get ahead of them, and turned them back with her voice and the bay's position. And she felt her heart going at a rate that took several minutes to settle back to something reasonable. Calder had seen it. He'd started moving her direction, but she'd handled it before he arrived, and when he pulled up beside her, his expression was the specific controlled expression of a man who has been frightened on someone else's behalf and is deciding not to say so. The bank, he said. They didn't get near it, she said. Her voice was even. Her hands were shaking slightly inside her gloves, and she didn't let that show. Good, he said, and went back to the west side. They got the herd down. They got them into the sheltered lower paddock with the timber windbreak on the north and the fresh hay she'd laid out that afternoon when she'd first seen the sky. She counted them again when they were in, 32. Calder latched the paddock gate. He stood with his hands on the top rail and looked at his herd in the near dark. She stood beside him. Neither of them spoke. The first flakes of the storm were already arriving, just scouts, advance notice, the real thing still hours away. You nearly went over that bank, he said. I didn't, she said. You nearly did. She turned to look at him. His profile in the dark was the same as always, set, controlled, the jaw doing the thing it did when he was holding something in. I took a calculated risk, she said. I judged the footing and the angle, and I moved. It worked. And if it hadn't, then it hadn't, she said. But it did. He turned to look at her then, and the look on his face was not the expression she'd expected, not anger, not relief, not the flat, controlled blankness that was his default response to things that had shaken him. It was something rawer, something that had clearly gotten past the usual controls. I don't know what I would have done, he said. The sentence sat in the cold air between them. She understood exactly what it meant and what it cost him to say it. She felt it land somewhere specific and deep. I didn't go over, she said. Her voice was very quiet. I'm here. He looked at her for another long moment. Then he looked back at the herd. Yes, he said. They walked back to the house through the beginning of the storm. She made supper. He sat at the table while she cooked, which he didn't usually do. He usually went to wash up and came back when the food was ready. But tonight he sat and she moved around him, and neither of them remarked on it. They ate. He had 3 servings of the stew, which was the most she'd ever seen him eat at one sitting, and she thought that said something about what the afternoon had cost him in terms of pure physical output. After, he sat with his coffee and she sat with her tea, and the storm arrived properly, not the slow building of the first one, but sudden and complete, a full commitment. The sound of it against the house, a steady and encompassing roar that meant the outside world had, for the moment, ceased to be accessible. The fence repair from last time, he said. The sections Garrett and I did. They'll hold. I know, she said. I watched you do them. He looked at her sideways. What did you see? That you were thorough, she said. that you doubled the wire in the weak spots and drove the posts 2 inches deeper than the guide standard, that you were building for the next storm while you were fixing the damage from the last one. He held his cup. My father taught me that, he said. Build for the next storm, not the one you just had. Good lesson. Only one he ever said out loud that I remember as a lesson, Calder said. The rest I just watched. She thought about that. What else did you watch? He was quiet for a while. The storm was very loud now, the full voice of a mountain winter that has decided to remind you of your own smallness relative to the altitude. I watched him choose the ranch over everything else that happened, Calder said. I watched him put every decision through the filter of what the ranch needed. Not what he needed, not what I needed, what the operation needed. He set his cup down slowly. I thought for a long time that was strength. What do you think now? She said. The question sat between them in the lamplight, and outside the storm was enormous, and the house held against it, and Calder Rusk sat across the table from Lenora Blythe and took longer to answer than she expected. I think he was afraid, he said, and the ranch was the one thing he knew how to love without it scaring him. Because it couldn't leave, she felt the weight of that land. Can I tell you something? She said. He looked at her. You do the same thing, she said. Not unkindly, just plainly. The way you talk about the herd, the fence, the operation. It's not cold. It's you know where you are with it. You know what it needs. You know how to give it what it needs. It doesn't require you to explain yourself. He said nothing. People are harder than that, she said. They change what they need. They don't tell you their weak spots until there's a problem. They're not, she searched for the word, predictable. And that makes them frightening if you're a person who needs to know what's coming. You're saying I'm frightened, he said. I'm saying most people are when it comes to other people. They just find different ways to show it. She looked at him steadily. Yours is that you build a life that doesn't require anyone. That way there's nothing to lose. The silence after that was the longest one she could remember. Outside, the storm hit the north wall like something trying to get in. Calder's hands were both flat on the table. He was looking at them, not at her, and his face had the expression she'd seen twice before, the one where something was happening behind his eyes that hadn't made it to his face yet, like water rising in a well, slow and certain. I told the first woman who came, he said, very quietly, that the mountain was hard, and she should know that before she came up. She came anyway. She lasted 4 days. When she left, she told me I was the coldest man she'd ever met. He paused. The fourth woman I tried. I made coffee before she was up. I asked her what she liked. He stopped. His jaw moved. I wasn't good at it. She said I was trying too hard and it felt like an interview. She left on the 7th day. Lenora said nothing. After the 7th woman left, he said, I stopped trying. I decided it was better to just be what I am and let them decide early. Shorter for everyone. And the schedule on the wall, she said. He looked up at her. That was the deciding early, she said. Hand them the rules right at the start. Make it clear there's no space here for anything you haven't already arranged. If they're going to leave, let them leave fast. His expression was the complicated one, the one that had no clean name. It wasn't malicious, she said. I know that. It's still, he stopped. Still a way of guaranteeing the outcome you already expect, she said. Yes, he was quiet for a very long time. The storm outside did not quiet with him. It was its own thing, indifferent to what was happening at the kitchen table, pressing against the windows and the door and the sealed frames with pure physical insistence. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower than usual, with the particular texture of something that has been held for a long time and is being set down carefully. I don't know how to make room for somebody, he said. She looked at him across the table, this difficult, careful, armored, tender man who talked to calves in the back of barns and gave hay to neighbors without calling it charity, and built for the next storm while he was still in the current one. Then start now, she said. He looked at her. She looked back. and the storm held them both in the house. On the mountain, in the middle of a winter that was not finished with them yet, and the lamp burned between them, and neither of them looked away. He didn't say anything else that night. After those 2 sentences, I don't know how to make room for somebody, and her answer, then start now. Calder sat at the table for another few minutes, with his hands flat on the wood and his eyes somewhere in the middle distance. And then he stood up, carried his cup to the wash basin, and went to his room. No good night, no acknowledgement of what had just passed between them. She sat alone at the table and listened to the storm and did not feel disappointed, because she had learned enough about this man to understand that what he'd said had cost him more than most people spend in a week of conversation, and that the going to bed afterward was not retreat, so much as it was a person needing to be alone with something large that had just happened inside them. She turned down the lamp. She went to bed. She lay in the dark and listened to the storm work at the house. And she thought about then start now, and what that meant not as a declaration, not as a resolution, but as the only honest answer to a man who had just told her the truest thing about himself he had ever told anyone. She didn't know if he would. Start, that is. She didn't know if saying a thing out loud and meaning it was the same as being able to do it, and she was realistic enough, and had been disappointed enough times in her life by that particular gap, not to assume the words guaranteed anything. But she had said it. He had heard it. That was a beginning. Whether it became anything more than a beginning was, at least in part, up to him. She fell asleep before she finished the thought. The storm ran 2 days. During those 2 days, something shifted on Ironpine Ridge that had no single moment she could point to, no scene she could describe exactly. Because it happened the way most real things happen, not in one dramatic instant, but in the accumulation of small ones, each individually unremarkable, collectively irreversible. Calder started eating breakfast inside. He had, for the entire time she'd been there, eaten in the barn during morning chores or not at all. She had assumed the first and confirmed it eventually when she found the evidence of it, the way he came back in at mid-morning with no hunger to him. But on the morning after the second storm arrived, she came out to find him at the table with his coat still on, drinking coffee, waiting. She didn't say anything about it. She made eggs and the last of the salt pork and set the plate in front of him and sat across with her own. He ate. She ate. Outside, the storm was in its second day and the world was white and inaccessible. Inside the kitchen, the stove was going and the curtains were drawn, and the 2 of them ate breakfast at the same table at the same time, and neither of them pointed at that fact, and that was the right way to treat it. After, he helped her wash the plates. That was the second thing. He just did it, picked up the cloth and dried what she washed and set things back where they went. And he knew where they went because he had been watching her, put things in their places for 7 weeks by then, and had apparently been paying attention. It took 10 minutes. When it was done, he went and put more wood on the fire and checked the stovepipe and sat back down at the table with the record book. She stood at the counter and felt the strangeness of it, not an unpleasant strangeness, more like the feeling of a word you've been trying to remember suddenly arriving, and the arrival being both satisfying and slightly surreal. This was what it looked like. Starting, not speeches. Not transformed personalities. Not a man who had become someone else overnight. Just a man choosing, one small thing at a time, to be present in the same space instead of adjacent to it. She let it be what it was. The storm broke on the second evening, and the third morning was the kind of morning that only comes after hard weather, on high ground absolutely still, the air so cold and clear it seemed to rain. The snow surface, untouched and blinding white under a sky that had gone the particular deep blue of something washed completely clean. Calder went out to assess the damage. She went with him. The north fence had held the repaired sections at least. There was a section of the east paddock that needed attention, a board gate that had taken the brunt of a drift and was hanging off its lower hinge, and the roof of the chicken coop had a section of shingles lifted by the wind. which she discovered when she counted the chickens and found them all alive, but extremely unhappy about the gap in the roof line. They worked through the morning on it. Calder fixed the gate. She got on the chicken coop roof with a handful of shingles and a pot of heated pine pitch and fixed the gap before the cold could set it in deeper. She was on the roof when she heard him below her. "You don't need to be up there," he said. "I know," she said. She drove another nail. "I'm already up here." A pause. "The pitch on that roof is steep. I've got good boots." She pressed the shingle flat and checked the seal. "Hand me the pot." He handed it up. She sealed the last 2 shingles, checked the whole section with her hand, and climbed back down. He was standing at the base of the ladder. He didn't help her down. He knew by now that offering her help she didn't need was the one thing reliably guaranteed to irritate her, but he was there in the way that people stand close to things they're concerned about without wanting to admit the concern. "It'll hold," she said. "I can see that," he said. She handed him the pitch pot. Their fingers overlapped on the handle for a second, just the cold wool of her gloves against the bare skin of his hand, brief and unintentional. He took the pot. He went to put it away. She stood in the chicken yard and looked up at the repaired roofline and then at the clear sky above it and felt, very simply, like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She didn't examine that feeling too closely. She just let it exist. It was Calder who brought up Red Willow Crossing. They were at supper, 4 days after the second storm, and he said, without any particular preamble, "I need to go into town for supplies on Thursday. Road should be passable by then." "All right," she said. "You said you'd come with me the first week. You said you knew what to buy." She looked at him. "I remember. The offer's still open." "Yes," she said, "of course." He nodded, went back to his food. She went back to hers and did not let herself smile, or at least not where he could see it, because the offer had been made 7 weeks ago, and the fact that he had held on to it turned it over and brought it out now in this specific and characteristically sideways fashion meant something that she understood very clearly and that he would have been mortified to have named directly. He wanted her beside him in town. He just needed it to be a practical thing first. Thursday came with good road conditions and a sky that promised nothing worse than cold. They drove down the mountain in the wagon, the same wagon she'd ridden up in 7 weeks ago, the same horses, the same road. Everything the same, except that she was no longer a stranger on a mountain she didn't know, and he was no longer a man she was still in the process of deciding about. Red Willow Crossing was busy for a Thursday, or busy by its own modest standard, several wagons at the hitching posts, a cluster of women on the general store porch, the postmaster's window open despite the cold. Felt the town notice them before they'd reached the main road. Not dramatically, just the particular quality of attention that small towns direct at things worth remarking on. Calder drove with the same even-handed competence he brought to everything physical, and his face was the same as always. And she thought probably he couldn't feel the attention the way she could. Or maybe he could and had learned to put it somewhere that didn't touch him. They tied up at the general store. Inside, the proprietor, a round-faced man named Aldous, who had the friendly efficiency of someone who had been doing this job for 20 years and found genuine satisfaction in it, looked up when they came in and then looked again. The way people look when they see something that revises an existing story. "Calder," he said. "Aldous," Calder said. Aldous looked at Lenora. "I'm Lenora Blythe," she said, before Calder could say whatever he was going to say, which she suspected would be minimal. "I've been managing the household on Ironpine Ridge." "I'd heard," Aldous said, with the careful neutrality of a man who had heard considerably more than that and was choosing which version to present. "Glad to see you're well." "I'm very well," she said. "Thank you." She took out her list and went to work. Calder dealt with the heavier items, the flour sacks and the grain order and the lamp oil she'd noted they were short on back in October. She went through the dry goods and the preserved items and the small things that keep a house running through a long winter. And she was aware the whole time of Aldous, watching her with the particular expression of a man updating his internal account of something. She had the list completed and was reviewing her tallies when the women from the porch came in. There were 3 of them, somewhere between her age and a decade older, with a kind of solid practicality in their faces that she associated with women who had been managing difficult situations for long enough that it had become simply the texture of their lives. They looked at her directly, which she respected, and the one in front a woman with dark hair and direct eyes who introduced herself as Marin said, "You're the one up on the ridge." "I am," Lenora said. "You've been there almost 2 months." "I have." Marin looked at her steadily. "The other women who came, they were friends of mine, some of them. Or acquaintances, at least. Clara Hendricks and Bess Paulson, and—" "I know the Count," Lenora said, not unkindly. "We all wondered." Marin said, and her tone was not hostile, just honest, the tone of a woman who had waited long enough to say something that she was going to say it plainly. "What made it different for you?" Lenora thought about how to answer that. She thought about the man at the back of the store lifting flour sacks with Aldous, who was not looking at this conversation, but was absolutely aware of it. "Nothing made it different," she said. "I just didn't leave." Marin looked at her for a moment. "That's all? He's not a cruel man," Lenora said. "I've known cruel men. He's not one. He's a man who built a life expecting to be alone in it, and the life fit that expectation so well that no one could figure out where to enter." She paused. "I just looked for the door until I found it." Marin was quiet. The second woman, younger, with a watchful quality, said, "And was there one? A door?" "There's always one," Lenora said. "It just isn't always in the obvious place." Calder appeared at the end of the aisle. He looked at the women, at Lenora, at the women again. His face was the usual controlled surface. "Ready when you are," he said to Lenora. She looked at Marin. "It was good to meet you," she said, and meant it. Marin's expression had changed in some way she couldn't entirely parse, not softened exactly, more like something had settled in it. "You too," Marin said. I hope it goes well up there." "It is going well," Lenora said. "Thank you." She went and settled the account with Aldous while Calder loaded the wagon. When she came out, he was tying down the last of the supplies, and he glanced at her as she climbed up onto the seat. "What did they want?" he said, climbing up beside her. "To understand," she said. He picked up the reins. "What did you tell them?" She looked at him sideways. "That you weren't cruel. That I found the door." He was quiet for a moment. The horses shifted. The street of Red Willow Crossing went about its business around them. "There wasn't a door," he said. "I know," she said. "I made one." His mouth moved at the corner. Not a smile, it never quite became a smile, but the closest thing to it that she'd learned to recognize as his, which was its own kind of smile if you'd been paying attention long enough. He drove them out of Red Willow Crossing and back up the mountain road. It was 2 days after the trip to town that Otis Bellwether came up the mountain. She had heard about Otis from Aldous, who had mentioned him in passing in the way people mention fixtures of a town, the postmaster. Been there 15 years, knew everyone's business, and could be relied upon to circulate it carefully, which was a polite way of saying he gossiped with discretion. He arrived on a gray sky morning on a horse that looked as reluctant as Dell had looked, and she saw him from the kitchen window and went to the door before he knocked. He was a small man, compact and neat, with a quality of contained energy that made her think of a good watch, everything wound tight and running precisely. He looked at her with barely concealed astonishment. "Miss Blythe," he said. "Mr. Bellwether," she said. "Come in out of the cold." He came in. He stood in the kitchen with his hat in his hands, and he looked at the curtains, and the food on the stove, and the household ledger open on the shelf, and the 2 cups on the table from breakfast, and the general fact of a kitchen that had been maintained with the particular warmth of a place, too. People were living in, and his expression was that of a man who had come prepared for one story and found himself standing inside a completely different one. "I came to collect the outgoing mail," he said, "and to see—" He stopped. "Whether I'd written one," she said. He had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. The other women sent letters, she said. I know. She went to the stove and poured him a cup of coffee without asking, because he'd just ridden up a mountain in December, and the decent thing to do was to warm a person before anything else. I don't have an outgoing letter, Mr. Bellwether. I have an incoming one, if there is one. He took the coffee with both hands. There's nothing incoming at present. He looked around the kitchen again. You've been here since October. Late October, she said. Yes. He turned the cup in his hands. He looked like a man reformulating the report he'd been planning to bring back down to Red Willow Crossing. People in town, he said carefully, have been curious. I know, she said. I met some of them Thursday. Marin Collis, he said, and it was somewhere between a question and a statement. Yes, He stopped again. She thought he was choosing words with more care than he usually applied to them. She was fond of Clara Hendricks, the one who left on the 4th day, Lenora said. Yes, Otis looked at his coffee. Clara came back to town in some distress. I believe it, Lenora said. She wasn't the right fit for the situation, and the situation wasn't explained well enough before she arrived. That's not her fault, and it's not Calder's either. It's just a mismatch that happened badly. She paused. It doesn't say anything about who Calder is. Otis looked at her with the sharp, assessing gaze of a man who has spent 15 years reading between the lines of everything people sent and received. Most people in town have a fairly settled opinion on who Calder Rusk is, he said. I know, she said. They're wrong about some of it. He was quiet for a moment. He stopped, turned his cup, tried again. He came into town once, about 3 years ago, when one of the Henderson boys broke his leg at the mill, and they were short for the harvest. Calder showed up with his wagon and 2 of his horses, and worked 2 days without being asked. Nobody said a word about it in front of him. He didn't say a word about it either. Otis paused. He drove away after, and that was the last time anyone saw him in town for 4 months. He doesn't want to be thanked for things, she said. No, Otis agreed, because if you're thanked, it means people noticed, and if people notice, they have a claim on you, she said. Or that's how it feels to him. Otis looked at her with something that was adjacent to wonder. You've worked him out, he said. I'm still working, she said. It takes time. The back door opened, and Calder came in from the barn, stopped when he saw Otis, and stood in the doorway with the cold coming off him and his expression doing the thing it did when his territory had been entered without his prior arrangement of it. Calder, Otis said, standing up straighter. Otis, Calder said. He looked at Lenora. He came for the mail, she said. There isn't any outgoing. I made him coffee. Calder looked at Otis. Otis looked back. There was a history between them that she couldn't fully read 15 years of Otis arriving to collect letters from women who were leaving. 15 years of Calder watching him come up the road and knowing what the arrival meant and what it confirmed. Nothing outgoing, Calder said. So I hear, Otis said. Calder looked at the coffee cup in Otis's hands, at the kitchen, at Lenora. He went to the stove and poured his own cup and sat down at the table, in the middle of the morning, in his own kitchen, with a visitor, and Lenora thought that probably Otis Bellwether had never in 15 years of mail delivery seen Calder Rusk sit down in the same room as another person during working hours. Otis sat back down slowly, like a man who isn't sure the chair will hold. Roads in fair condition for December, Calder said. Fair enough, Otis agreed, soft in the middle section. Always is after the second storm. Drain's wrong there. I've been meaning to bring gravel up for 3 years. I've been meaning to say something about it for 3 years, Otis said. There was a pause, and then something happened that she had not in 8 weeks witnessed. Calder Rusk laughed. Not the corner of the mouth movement she'd catalogued and counted. An actual, short, genuine sound, low, brief, nothing elaborate about it. The laugh of a man who didn't do it often enough to be comfortable with the duration. But real. Otis looked startled for half a second, then smiled the smile of a man who has carried a complicated and mostly sad story for a long time and has just been offered something that changes the ending. Lenora drank her coffee and said nothing, and felt the room hold the moment like a cupped hand holding water carefully, without drawing attention to the care. Otis stayed another 20 minutes. He and Calder talked about the road and the season and the Halverson situation. Calder confirmed that the hay had been sent, and Otis said Halverson had told half the town about it, which made Calder's expression go briefly pained, which made Otis's mouth twitch, which was its own small comedy, played out in two men who had known each other for 15 years without ever quite being at ease. When Otis left, he shook Calder's hand at the door. He turned to Lenora and said, "It was very good to meet you properly, Miss Blythe." "And you, Mr. Bellwether," she said. He rode down the mountain, and she watched him go from the kitchen window, and she knew that by nightfall the story he carried back to Red Willow Crossing would be a different one than any he'd brought back before. Calder stood beside her at the window, looking down the road. "He'll talk," Calder said. "He will," she agreed. "About the kitchen." "About me sitting down," he paused. "About you, probably," she said. He was quiet. "Does it bother you?" she asked. "What they'll say?" He thought about it, genuinely thought about it, the way he thought about things, taking it seriously rather than dismissing it or responding defensively. "It used to," he said. "The way they talked, like I was a problem that kept defeating solutions." And now he looked at the road where Otis had gone. "Now it's different." "How?" she said. He turned from the window and looked at her, and the look was the direct one, the one without the usual careful distance built into it. "Because what he's going to say is different," he said. "It's the first time in 15 years what he says is going to be different." She held that. "Yes," she said, "it is." He went back to work. She stood at the window a moment longer and thought about what had just been said in the space between those few sentences, the whole of what it meant to him. Not just that Otis would carry a different story, but that there was a different story to carry. That something had changed on this mountain in a way that was visible now. That the evidence, which he always needed, which was always the language he trusted most, was showing him something new. She went and added a log to the fire and started on the afternoon bread. The week after Otis's visit was the week Calder began changing things. Not announcing them, not explaining them, just changing them. The schedule on the wall was the first thing. She came downstairs one morning and it was gone, and there was a moment where she stood looking at the bare section of wall with a complicated set of feelings. Because the schedule had been there since she arrived, and its presence had been a kind of marker, a relic of the previous arrangement, the one-person arrangement. The life built to fit exactly one, and its absence meant something he hadn't said in words. She didn't ask about it. She cooked breakfast. He came in from the barn and sat down and they ate. He had his coffee. She had her tea. After a while he said to the table rather than to her, "Schedule didn't account for two people." "No," she agreed. "It didn't. That was all." The second thing was the household ledger. She had been keeping her own notes in her own hand, in a small book she'd brought with her from Harwick, tracking the household expenditures and the pantry inventory and the things that needed attention in the coming month. Practical record keeping, the kind she'd always done, the kind that made the difference in February between adequate and desperate. He found it on the table one afternoon when she'd left it out, and she came back from the barn to find him reading it. Stopped in the doorway. He looked up. She waited. "You're doing this separately," he said. "I didn't know whether you wanted me in the main ledger," she said. He looked at the book in his hands. He looked at the main ledger on the shelf. He set her book on the table and went to the shelf and got the main ledger and brought both to the table and sat down. "Here," he said, and opened the main ledger to the current month. She sat across from him. He pointed to the household column, the entries he'd always kept in his own blunt hand, the practical record of the operation's domestic side. "What's in your book goes here," he said. "We can merge them." She looked at the ledger. She looked at him. "All right," she said. "You write a cleaner hand than I do," he said. "Makes sense for you to keep this section." She reached across and drew the ledger toward her. She found the pen. She looked at the top of the current page, where his name was written in the corner. C. Rusk, Ironpine Ridge, year of record. She looked up. Should I add my name? Yes, he said. She wrote it, L. Blythe. Below his, on the same line, a small thing, 4 words, easy to overlook. She looked at it for a second. Then she began transferring the entries. He sat across from her while she wrote, not reading, not working, just present, and that was the third thing, the one she kept counting, the way she'd counted everything from the beginning. He was choosing to be in the room, not because the room had something he needed to do in it, but because she was in it. This was making room. This was what it looked like. Not speeches, not declarations. A man learning, one small daily thing at a time, the practice of allowing another person to exist in his space without bracing for them to leave. She told him about the man in Harwick on a Sunday evening in late December. She hadn't planned to. She had been mending a tear in the heavy outer coat she wore for barn work, and he had been at the table with a catalog of spring cattle stock that he'd received in the mail. And the evening had the quality of an evening that has settled into itself without effort, which was still new enough that she noticed it. She told him because she'd been thinking about it for days, not obsessively, just circling it the way you circle a thing you're deciding whether to put down or carry further. She had been honest with him about her reasons for coming, about what she valued, about how she read him. It seemed wrong to leave this unspoken, this part of herself, the part that explained why she understood certain things about certain kinds of damage. There was a man in Harwick, she said, before I came here. He looked up from the catalog. We were engaged for a short time, she said. Kept her voice even, practical, the way he talked about things she'd already processed, past the point of pain. He wasn't violent. I want to be clear about that, nothing like that. He used words the way some people use a closed fist. Smiling the whole time. Calder set the catalog down. I stayed 9 months, she said, not because I didn't see it. I saw it fairly early. I stayed because I kept thinking I was misreading it, that the version of him I'd seen at the beginning was the real one, and the rest was something I could help him with. She smoothed the coat fabric in her lap. I was wrong about that. What happened? Calder said. His voice was even, but she could hear the tightening under it. I left, she said, finally. And he was very kind about it, which was its own kind of awful. He was kind about it. The way he was kind about everything. In a way that made you feel like the problem was yours. She looked up. I've spent a good while since then, making sure I know the difference between a man who is difficult and a man who is unkind. They feel similar from the inside of them sometimes. But they're not the same. Calder was looking at her steadily. When I read your letter, she said, I knew within 2 paragraphs you weren't unkind. Difficult, probably. Set in your ways, certainly. Not someone who was going to be easy to live with. She paused. But not unkind. There's a quality to unkind men's writing. It's in what they omit as much as what they say. You didn't omit anything. You said exactly what was true and let me make my own decision. He was quiet for a long time. I've been compared to a lot of things, he said slowly. In the letters I've gotten back, cold, impossible. Closed, he paused. One woman told me I was the loneliest person she'd ever met. Were you? He looked at the table. Yes, he said. I just didn't know it was a problem. You thought it was just the way things were. The way things were, he agreed. The way things had always been. You stop noticing it after a while. It just feels like normal. She thought about the child who had stopped asking questions. The man who had built his life to expect no answers. It wasn't normal, she said. It was just familiar. He picked up the catalog again, but he wasn't looking at it. He was holding it the way a person holds something when their hands need to be doing something while their mind is somewhere else entirely. The man in Harwick, he said. Did he know what he was doing to you? Some of it, she said. Not all. Some people do damage the way bad weather does not because they choose to, but because they haven't learned what they're capable of. And some people choose. Yes, she said. Some choose. He set the catalog down again. Which was he? A little of both, she said honestly. Which made him harder to leave than either one alone. Calder was quiet for a long time, long enough that she went back to her mending and let the silence do what silence did between them. Now not close things off, but give them room. I'm glad you left, he said. She looked up. His face was entirely serious. Nothing careful or controlled about his expression right now, just the plain, unguarded statement of a man saying something true. I'm glad you left, he said again, and I'm glad you came here. Both of those things, she held his gaze. So am I, she said. Picked up the catalog. She went back to the coat. Outside the window, the mountain was dark and still and cold, and inside the lamp burned at its even rate, and the stove held its heat, and the two of them sat in the same room in a silence that had no distance left in it. That was when she knew. Not that he loved her, she thought he did, in the particular inarticulate way that some people carry love like cargo, present and heavy, and not fully named. But she'd known that for a while, in the way you know things you haven't been told yet. What she knew in that moment, sitting in the kitchen on Ironpine Ridge in the deep of a December evening, was that she did too. Not because he had become easy. He hadn't. He was still the man who needed to be alone to process things, who communicated sideways, who showed care through practical action rather than words, who would probably never in his life be the kind of person who said the large emotional things easily and naturally. But he was trying. He was trying in every small specific way available to him, without being asked, without being pressured, without any guarantee that the trying would be enough, because he had no experience of trying being enough, had only the long evidence of everyone leaving regardless. And he was doing it anyway. She put another stitch in the coat. He turned a page in the catalog. The fire settled in the stove. She thought about the ledger on the shelf with both their names at the top. She thought about the bare wall where the schedule used to be. She thought about a man who ate breakfast inside now, and dried plates, and laughed once in front of another person, and sat in the kitchen on Sunday evenings because that was where she was. She thought, this is what it looks like when someone decides to be brave. Not the dramatic kind of brave. The harder kind, the daily, repetitive, unglamorous kind that asks you to keep going towards something that frightens you, even when there's no music playing and no one watching, and no guarantee it ends well. She thought, I am going to be here for all of it. And she finished her mending and went to bed and slept the way she had been sleeping since the night of the second storm deeply, without waking. Like a person who has finally arrived somewhere and put their bag down and stopped calculating distances. January on Ironpine Ridge was a different animal from December. December had been the month of storms and adjustments, and the slow, incremental work of two people learning to exist in the same space without flinching. January was quieter in some ways, and louder in others quieter because the heavy weather had passed its peak, and the mountain had settled into its deep winter cold. Louder because the silence between her and Calder had changed quality entirely. It was no longer the silence of two people being careful with each other. It was the silence of two people who had stopped needing to be careful, and that was a different thing altogether, warmer and more spacious. The kind of silence that only develops between people who have said enough of the hard things that the quiet left behind is actually restful. She noticed the change most in the mornings. He still got up before her that hadn't changed, probably never would. It was simply the rhythm of a man whose body had been trained by 20 years of animal schedules to wake at 4:30 regardless of circumstance. But he had started leaving the stove loaded and lit before he went out, so that when she came down the kitchen was already warm. He never said anything about it. It was just a thing that had begun happening, the way the breakfast had begun happening, the way the plate drying had begun happening, just small adjustments accumulated without announcement. The evidence of a man rearranging his habits to account for someone else's presence. She started leaving his coffee set up at night, so it was ready to go on the fire when he got up. She never said anything about that either. They were conducting a conversation entirely in logistics, and both of them understood it perfectly. But January also brought something she hadn't anticipated, which was the weight of the unresolved. Not between them, that wasn't the right word for it. Things between them were in the slow and unmistakable way of genuinely changing things, resolving. What she felt was something more specific, the awareness that they had arrived somewhere significant without naming where they were. That the ledger had both their names on it and the schedule was off the wall, and he sat across from her at breakfast every morning and laughed occasionally, quietly, in the specific, understated way that was his, and none of it had been spoken aloud in terms of what it meant for the future. She was not by nature a woman who needed things spoken aloud. She had said that to herself since October, and she had meant it, and she still meant it. But there was a practical reality here that couldn't be indefinitely deferred, which was that she had come to Ironpine Ridge on the explicit terms of Calder's original letter, a trial arrangement, compatibility to be assessed, marriage a possibility if things proved workable. She had been here 3 months. Things had proved workable in ways that exceeded anything either of them had written in letters to each other, and the original terms of the arrangement had not been revisited. She was not going to raise it. That felt clearly right to her, not from pride or stubbornness, but because she understood that Calder needed to arrive at things on his own timeline and that pushing him toward a conclusion before he'd reached it himself was the surest way to make him retreat from it. She had learned that the way she'd learned everything about him, by watching, by waiting, by trusting that the direction of travel was right, even when the pace was his. But she was aware of it. She was aware of the way January was moving toward February, and February towards spring, and spring toward a point at which the practical question of what this arrangement actually was would have to be answered by someone. Kept it to herself. She did the work of the house and the barn and the daily partnership they had built, and she trusted the man she had come to know over 3 months of close and difficult proximity, and she waited. It was Marin Collis who came up the mountain in the second week of January, which surprised Lenora considerably. She rode up alone on a solid gray horse, practical and unhurried, and she tied up at the porch rail and knocked with the directness of a woman who had decided to do something and had not left herself a route to change her mind. Lenora opened the door. "I should have come sooner," Marin said by way of greeting. "Can I come in, of course," Lenora said. Marin came in and sat at the kitchen table and accepted coffee with both hands, the same way Garrett had, the same way Otis had all these people coming up the mountain and sitting in the kitchen that was no longer bare and cold, all of them recalibrating something in their understanding of this place. I said something to Clara Hendricks. Marin said, without preamble, once she had the cup in hand. After she came back from here, I said that the man on the ridge was simply not capable of being lived with, and that any woman who went up there was fooling herself. She looked at Lenora directly. "I've been thinking about that since I met you in the store." "What have you been thinking?" Lenora said. "That I said it with a lot of confidence for someone who had never actually been up here," Marin said. And that Clara was distressed when she came back, and distressed people's accounts of situations are incomplete, sometimes. Not dishonest, just incomplete. Lenora turned her cup in her hands. "Clara wasn't wrong that it was hard," she said. "It was hard. Still is sometimes. Calder is not an easy man. But hard and impossible aren't the same," she said. "And I think what most people in town decided not meanly, just from what they had to go on, was that the situation was fixed. That he was a certain way, and that was the end of the analysis." Marin looked at her cup. "And he's not. He's changing," Lenora said. "Slowly, on his own terms. You can't make a man like Calder change the moment it feels like pressure he closes off. But he can change himself if he decides to, and he has been." She paused. Marin was quiet for a moment. "Clara told me he once handed her a list of rules on her first evening and didn't speak to her the rest of the night." "He handed me the same list," Lenora said. Marin looked at her. "It's gone now," Lenora said. "He took it down himself." The sound of boots on the porch saved them both from the particular charged silence that followed that statement. Calder came through the door and stopped when he saw Marin, and his expression did the recalibrating thing, not hostile, just the split-second adjustment of a man who had not anticipated a visitor. "Marin Collis," he said. "Calder," she said. He looked between them. He hung up his coat. He poured himself coffee. And then, and Lenora watched this with a specific interior attention, he sat down at the table. Not in the back room, not back out to the barn. At the table with his coffee, in the same room as a visitor who had not been his idea. Marin looked at him with the frank assessment of a woman who had made up her mind about someone and was now in the process of revising it in real time. "I came to apologize," she said. Calder looked at her. "For the things I've said about you in town," she said. "I don't know that you've ever heard them directly, but I said them, and I said them to women who came up here, and I don't know what effect that had on how things went." So she held his gaze. "I'm sorry for it." Calder held his cup. She had seen him receive apologies before, not many, but a few, small ones, the minor social currency of daily life, and he generally received them with discomfort, as though he didn't know where to put them. This one was different. This was a direct, genuine statement of accountability from a woman who had no particular reason to offer it and had come a long way in January cold to deliver it in person. He said, "You weren't wrong about the way things were." "Maybe not," Marin said, "but the way things were isn't the same as the way things are. And I was talking about one like it was the other." A pause. "I appreciate that," Calder said. It came out simply, without embellishment, which was the only way he said things that meant the most to him. Marin stayed for an hour. The conversation that developed was not effortless. Calder was never effortless, but it was real, which was better than effortless. He talked about the season, about the herd situation, about the fence repair, and gradually, in the way that genuine conversation has of finding its own level, about the ranch and what it had taken to build it from what his father had left him. Marin listened with genuine interest and asked questions that showed she understood what she was hearing. When she left, she shook Lenora's hand and then, after a brief pause, Calder's. He shook it without flinching, which she noted. They watched her ride down the mountain road. "She didn't have to come," Calder said. "No," Lenora agreed. "She did it because of you. She did it because she's an honest woman who looked at a situation and decided she'd been unfair," Lenora said. "I might have given her new information, but the decision to come was hers." He was quiet for a moment. "Town's changing how it thinks about this place," he said. "Yes," she said. He turned from the road and looked at her. "That doesn't bother you? Being the reason for it?" "Does it bother you?" she said. He thought about it. She acknowledged the word privately, without fanfare, that he still thought before he answered things. That he hadn't started performing ease in response to her. That his thoughtfulness was still genuinely his own. "It did," he said, "the idea of people talking about what's up here. Deciding things about it." He paused. "It feels different now." "How?" He looked at the road where Marin had gone. "Because what they're deciding is different," he said. "And because I care less about what they decide than I used to." She looked at him sideways. "Why do you care less?" He met her eyes. "Because I know what's actually here," he said. She held his gaze for a long beat. Then she went inside to start dinner, because some moments are complete in themselves and don't need anything added. He asked her on a Tuesday, not a significant Tuesday, no occasion, no build-up that she could point to afterward, no special arrangement. It was the last week of January, a clear, cold afternoon, and they had spent the morning doing the kind of routine work that constitutes most of a life on a working ranch. She had reorganized the pantry and done a full inventory against the February projections. He had ridden the fence line and repaired a section of the east paddock that had heaved with the frost. They had eaten lunch across from each other and discussed, practically, and with the specificity of two people who had been doing this together for months, whether the hay supply would run sufficient through to the spring grass, or whether he needed to send for more before the road got uncertain again. He had gone back out after lunch. She was at the kitchen table in the mid-afternoon with the ledger their ledger, both names at the top working through the March projections. Because February planning happened in January and March planning happened in February, and that was how you survived on a mountain. She heard him come in. She heard him stop. She finished the line she was writing because numbers need to be finished or they become wrong, and then she looked up. He was standing in the kitchen doorway with his coat still on, which meant he'd come straight in from outside rather than hanging it on the porch, which he never did. His hat was still on, too. He had the expression she had seen on his face the night of the second storm, the one where something was happening underneath that hadn't made it to the surface yet, water rising in a well. She waited. He came and sat down across from her. He took off his hat and set it on the table, which was something else he didn't usually do. He looked at the ledger between them, at their names at the top of the page, and then he looked at her. "I've been thinking about the original terms," he said. Her pen was still in her hand. She set it down. "So have I," she said. He nodded, as though this didn't surprise him. "You haven't said anything." "Neither have you." He looked at the hat in his hands. He turned it once, a slow rotation, the brim moving through his fingers. It was the equivalent in Calder Rusk terms of someone else pacing the room. "I've been trying to find the right way to say it," he said. "I've been trying for about 3 weeks." She said nothing. She gave him the room. "I'm not good at this," he said. "I know," she said. "Say it anyway." He looked up. "When you came here," he said, "I expected you to leave. I expected it the way I expected the north fence to need work every winter, not because I wanted it, just because that was what the evidence had always shown me." And he stopped, started again. "I didn't change anything to make you want to stay. I told myself it was because I didn't want to perform something I wasn't, but the truth is I think I was also." He paused, and she could see the effort in it. The specific and unfamiliar effort of a man making himself say the true thing instead of the easier adjacent thing. "Protecting myself," he said. "If I didn't try and you left, at least I hadn't tried." "I know," she said quietly. "But you didn't leave," he said. "And I started trying anyway, eventually. Not because you asked me to." Because stopped. His jaw moved. "Because you were still here. And the fact that you were still here made me want to be someone worth staying for. Which is not something I've wanted before. Not like this." She felt the particular weight of that sentence settle into her chest. "Calder," she said. "I'm going to finish," he said. Not unkindly, just the statement of a man who knows if he stops, he might not start again. The original terms were marriage, if we proved compatible. "I know we haven't discussed it since you arrived. I know I should have brought it up sooner, and I didn't because I was—" He looked at his hat. "Afraid of what you'd say. What were you afraid I'd say?" she said. He looked at her. "That you'd had enough time to see clearly what this is, and you'd decided it wasn't worth the long term." She let that sit for a moment. "Calder Rusk," she said, and her voice was very even. "I sealed your windows with tallow and flannel, and hung your mother's curtains, and fixed your chicken coop roof in December, and wrote my name in your ledger, and moved 32 head through a coming storm with you, and sat at your kitchen table. Through 2 of the worst storms of the season, and I haven't unpacked the second half of my trunk yet, because I've been waiting for you to tell me whether to bother." He stared at her. "The second half of your trunk," he said. "The half with the things I wasn't sure I was keeping out," she said. "Because I didn't know if I was staying." Something moved through his expression, something that was almost pain and almost relief simultaneously. The specific feeling of a person realizing that someone else has been carrying the same uncertainty they've been carrying, in a parallel and equally quiet fashion for months. "You're staying," he said. "I'm staying," she said. "If you're asking." "I'm asking," he said. "I'm asking you to marry me. I'm asking you to—" He stopped and seemed to decide that the list of what he was asking was too long and too much for one moment. "I'm asking," he said. "Just that." She looked at him across the table, with the ledger between them and the curtains at the windows, and the warmth of the stove at her back, and the hat turning slowly in his hands, and she thought about October. The pewter sky and the cold and the woman's sweeping steps, and the man who had stood with his back to her checking harness on his horses, and she thought about 9 women and long winters, and a 7-year-old boy who stopped asking questions. And she thought about all the small accumulations of this strange and difficult and entirely genuine winter. "Yes," she said. He put down his hat. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, which was the most deliberately intimate gesture she had seen from him in 3 months. And his hand was large and rough and warm from the work he'd just been doing, and he didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. She turned her hand over under his and held it. They stayed like that for a while in the kitchen on a Tuesday afternoon on Ironpine Ridge, while the January cold pressed against the sealed windows and went no further. They married on the last Saturday of February in Red Willow Crossing. She had not expected the number of people who came. It was not a grand occasion, she hadn't wanted one, and Calder would not have survived one, and they had agreed on something small and practical, which had apparently meant different things to each of them. She had envisioned, perhaps, Otis and Aldous and Marin and whoever happened to be in the street. What she got was most of the town, ranged along the front of the hall that Aldous had opened and swept and decorated with pine boughs and dried flowers from somebody's store of summer things. All of it arranged without anyone asking her or Calder, because that was apparently what Red Willow Crossing did when it decided a thing mattered. Calder stood at the front of the hall in his good coat, a coat she had discovered in the back of the wardrobe and brushed and pressed without telling him, so that when it appeared the morning of the wedding he had looked at it, and then at her, with the expression that still had no clean name, and he was the most visibly uncomfortable she had ever seen him, which was saying something, but she came in on Garrett's arm because she had asked him, and he had gone red in the face and said yes immediately. And she thought that he was possibly the best man in Red Willow Crossing, and that Calder was lucky to have him for a friend, even if neither of them would ever say it that way. Calder looked at her when she came in, and his face did something that she had not seen it do before in 3 months of close observation. All the careful control he maintained, all the managed surface of him, simply was not there for a moment. He looked at her with his whole face open, not with the shutter drop that she'd learned to catch when something caught him off guard, but with genuine unguarded recognition. The expression of a man seeing exactly what he wanted and knowing it and not being able to hide the knowing. It lasted about 4 seconds before the control came back. She found those 4 seconds the most precious thing she had seen in her life to that point, and she filed them in the place where she kept the things that mattered most. The ceremony was short. The justice of the peace was a solid, gray-haired man named Fitch, who had clearly performed hundreds of these and had the practical efficiency of someone who understood that what the words pointed to mattered more than how long the words took. Calder spoke his part in a voice that was steady and clear, and she spoke hers the same way. And when it was done and Fitch said what needed to be said, Calder leaned forward and kissed her with the same focused deliberateness he brought to everything he did not brief, not performative, not self-conscious, just present. Someone in the back of the hall made a sound that might have been a cheer. Calder pulled back and looked at her with the expression she was going to spend the rest of her life being glad existed. "Well," he said. "Well," she said. The hall erupted around them, and Calder Rusk stood in the middle of Red Willow Crossing, surrounded by more people than he had willingly been in a room with in years, and he did not go to the door. She watched him find his footing in it. It was not easy for him. She could see the effort. The way he positioned himself slightly apart from the densest clusters of people, the way he answered questions in the shortest accurate form available, the way he looked for her in the room at intervals and seemed to stabilize when he found her, the way a ship uses a fixed point. She circulated more easily than he did, and she was glad she could, because every time she looked back at him, she could see the slight relaxation that happened when their eyes met. And she understood that she was the fixed point, and she took the responsibility of that seriously. Garrett pressed a glass into Calder's hand and said something to him low and direct, and Calder's mouth moved at the corner, and Garrett laughed. Otis shook Calder's hand with both of his. Marin Collis embraced Lenora briefly and said into her ear, "I'm very glad I came up the mountain." And Lenora said, "So am I," and meant both things at once. Dell was there, to her mild surprise. He stood at the edge of the room and ate more than anyone else and left early. But he came, and she thought that counted for something. Old man Halverson arrived late on a horse that looked as ancient as he did, and he pushed through to Calder with the directness of a man who has something to say and is not going to let a crowd stop him saying it. He grabbed Calder's hand and shook it and said, loud enough for several people to hear, "The hay saw my herd through. I'm not a man who forgets." Calder looked somewhere between gratified and mortified, which was his exact response to being thanked publicly, and said something brief that Lenora didn't catch, and Halverson nodded and went to find the food. She ended up beside Calder at some point in the afternoon without quite planning it, the two of them standing at the edge of the room while the town talked and ate around them, and she said quietly, "How are you doing?" He looked at her. "Ask me in an hour. Is that honest, or are you being polite?" "It's honest," he said. "An hour ago I would have said, 'Ask me in another hour.'" She smiled. He looked at her smile, which he still did noticed it, specifically. The way you notice something that isn't common enough to take for granted, and said, very quietly, "Lenora, yes, thank you for unpacking the second half of the trunk." She looked at him for a moment. Then she took his hand, which was there beside hers, and held it. They stood like that in the middle of the room, in the middle of the town, in the middle of the life that was beginning, and outside the February sky was clear and cold and very blue, and the mountain above Red Willow Crossing held its snow, and the road up to Ironpine Ridge was visible from the hall window if you knew where to look. Spring came late to the ridge, the way it always did, not a sudden arrival but a gradual negotiation, the cold releasing its grip 1 degree at a time, the snow pulling back from the south-facing slopes first, while the north-facing sides held winter for weeks longer. She had been warned about mountain springs by Garrett's wife, a quiet woman named Ilsa, who had come to the wedding and had the particular patience of someone who had spent 20 years, married to a man who spent most of his time outside. "It's not like Valley Spring," Ilsa had said. "Down there it arrives. Up here it argues." She understood what Ilsa meant by April. But the arguing spring had its own particular beauty, which was the beauty of things that change slowly enough that you can watch them change. She could stand at the kitchen window in the morning and see day by day where the snow line had retreated. She could watch the south slope's brown grass emerge from under its white cover, tentative and matted and alive. She could track the exact week that the creek at the base of the north pasture lost its ice, not a specific day, just a week where it was ice, and then a week where it wasn't, and in between was the quiet, ongoing fact of the melt. She ordered the rose canes in February, and they arrived in late March, packed in damp burlap. 8 bare root climbing roses of the variety she'd read would handle the altitude not well. The catalog had been honest about that. They would struggle the first winter, and she'd lose some of them probably, but the ones that took would be suited to the place. Calder found them on the kitchen table when he came in from the morning feeding, still in their burlap. He picked one up and looked at it. It was, objectively, not much to look at: a stick with a few leafless lateral canes and a root ball that looked like the whole enterprise might be optimistic. "Roses," he said. "Climbing roses," she said, "for the porch post. The south-facing one, it gets the most light." He looked at the cane in his hand. "Roses don't generally take up here, I know," she said. "These ones might. They're bred for cold. The catalog said altitude up to 6,000 feet. We're at 5,800. Then we're in range." He set the cane down with the careful neutrality he used when he disagreed, but had decided the disagreement wasn't worth the conversation. She had learned to read the difference between that neutrality and the neutrality of genuine indifference, and she let this one go, because she also understood that he'd given up the right to veto things like roses when he'd added her name to the ledger. She planted them on a Thursday in early April, when the ground was soft enough to work. Calder was out with the herd, and she dug the holes herself, the right depth and the right spacing, amended the soil with the compost she'd been building in the kitchen waste bin since November, and set each cane with its roots spread properly, and packed the soil firm around them, and stood back and looked at a row of sticks beside the porch post. They looked, she had to admit, extremely unconvincing. She staked them to the post and went inside. Calder looked at them when he came in for lunch. He stood on the porch for a moment looking at the row of canes, and his expression was the specific expression of a man who is being respectful of an endeavor he privately considers doomed. She let him have it. 3 weeks later, when the first new growth appeared, the tiny red-edged buds breaking from the lateral canes with the aggressive optimism of something that had been told repeatedly it couldn't be here and was doing it anyway, she said nothing. She just watched him notice them on his way in from the barn, watched him stop and look at the canes for a moment longer than he would have if nothing was happening, and then come inside without saying anything. That evening at dinner, he said, 2 of the 8 are coming. 3, she said. Check the far one. He looked at her. I checked this morning, she said. He went back to his food. But the corner of his mouth moved. By June, those 3 roses were sending up new canes aggressively enough that she needed to redirect them along the guide wire she'd strung. And by July, they had leaves and the beginning of buds, and Calder had stopped pretending not to look at them when he passed the porch. The summer on Ironpine Ridge was the kind of summer that makes you understand why people stay on mountains, despite everything the mountains ask of you. The light was extraordinary, high and clear and long, lasting until 9 at night with a quality of gold in the late hours that the valley never got. The herd was in good condition, better than last year's, because the winter had been managed well, and the spring grass had come in adequate, and the north fence held for the first time in 3 years without a seasonal repair. Calder hired Dell back for summer work, which she thought said something about his capacity for tolerance. And Dell was measurably better than he'd been in December, possibly because he'd spent the winter thinking about how badly he'd performed, and possibly just because he was 20 and 20-year-olds improve if you wait long enough. Garrett and Ilsa came up for dinner in June, which was the first time anyone had come to the ranch for something other than work or mail since Lenora had arrived. She cooked more than enough, which was habit, and Ilsa brought a rhubarb pie that was the best thing Lenora had eaten in 6 months, and she said so directly, which made Ilsa visibly pleased in the way of a person who doesn't get enough direct compliments. Calder and Garrett sat on the porch after dinner, with their coffee in the long evening light, and she and Ilsa sat inside with the window open so the warm air came in, and she could hear their voices, not the words. Just the cadence of 2 men who had known each other a long time, talking about nothing that required intensity. Ilsa looked around the kitchen, the curtains, the stocked shelves, the repaired areas visible in the woodwork, the ledger on the shelf with 2 names on it, and said, "It's a different place than it was." "You'd been here before?" "Once, 4 years ago. Garrett needed to check in about something. I came along." She looked at the curtains. There were no curtains. The whole house felt like nobody was sure they were allowed to touch anything. "That's about right," Lenora said. Ilsa turned her cup in her hands in the way that people do when they're deciding whether to say the next thing. "How did you do it?" she said. "I'm not asking to be nosy. I'm asking because I have 3 younger cousins who've ended up in situations with men who've closed themselves off, and I never know what to tell them." Lenora thought about how to answer honestly. "I didn't do anything to him," she said. "That's the honest answer. I didn't fix him. I didn't change him. I just stayed and let him see what happened when someone stayed." Because he'd never actually seen it. She paused. Most people in that situation leave eventually, even if they try hard, because the trying is so exhausting and the return is so slow. And every time someone leaves, the person who's been left adds it to the evidence that they've always been building, the evidence that says, "See, everyone goes. There's no point opening up." So they close off more, and the next person arrives, and it's even harder. Ilsa was listening. "The only way to interrupt that," Lenora said, "is to just not be the next person who leaves." Which sounds simple. It isn't. She looked at her cup. You have to be sure enough about who the person actually is underneath the closed-off part to know whether the staying is worth it. Because some people are closed off because they're frightened and damaged. And some people are closed off because they're fundamentally unkind, and the closing off is a protection for everyone else. She paused. Those are not the same situation, and you cannot treat them the same way. How do you know the difference? Ilsa said. You watch them with things they don't know you're watching, Lenora said. People who are frightened and damaged are kind when they think no one's looking. People who are unkind when they think no one's looking. She thought about the back corner of the barn, the calf, the slow circles of a rough hand along a frightened animal's neck. The private behavior tells you, it always does, if you're patient enough to wait for it. Ilsa sat with that for a long moment. I'll tell them that, she said. It was in late July that Calder did the thing she hadn't expected. She came in from checking the garden she'd started on the south side of the house, an ambitious project for the altitude. More successful than the roses in some respects and less in others, and found him at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and a pen, writing. Calder almost never wrote anything that wasn't a ledger entry or a supply order. He looked up when she came in and then back at the paper with the expression of a man trying to outrun his own self-consciousness. She hung up her hat and poured water from the pitcher and didn't ask. After a while he said, I'm writing to Garrett about the south pasture drainage situation. Easier to explain in writing what I'm thinking. She sat down. She looked at the paper without making it a thing. You could just tell him when he comes up. I know, he said. He kept writing. She watched him for a moment. His hand moved slowly. He was not a natural writer. The words cost him something, but he was doing it. Composing an explanation of something complex in writing, because it was, for him, sometimes easier to arrive at the precise thing on paper than in speech. She understood what she was looking at. She was looking at a man learning to communicate in a new register. Finding out at 40-something years of age that there were more ways available to him than the ones he'd been using. Not because she'd told him to, not because she'd suggested it. Because he had decided to, because something in the previous 9 months had made trying feel like an option rather than a risk. She went back to her garden notes and let him write. Later he read her what he'd written, haltingly, checking her face as he went. And she listened and asked 2 questions about the drainage plan itself, and told him the second paragraph was clearer than the first, and he nodded and crossed something out and rewrote it. They sat at the table for an hour, each working on their own thing, in the same room, in the same ease. This, she thought, was the thing that was hardest to explain to people who hadn't lived it. Not the dramatic moments, those were easy to describe, the storms and the cattle, and the night he'd told her about his mother, and the morning she'd hung his mother's curtains. Those made sense as a story. What was harder to convey was this. The ordinary hour, 2 people at a table, the wood settling in the stove, the sound of a pen on paper, the particular quality of silence that has no loneliness in it. This was what had been missing from this house for 30 years. Not grand gestures, not fixed personalities, just the ordinary inhabited warmth of 2 people choosing, daily, to be in the same life. The autumn came, and the roses did what the catalog had warned her. They would do the 2 that had bloomed in July, and August dropped their leaves, and the new growth went to a color that was not quite dead, but not quite living either. The particular arrested state of something that has gone into itself to wait. She cut them back as recommended and mulched the roots with pine needles and straw and hoped. Calder watched her do this without comment. In November, when the first hard frost came and she checked the canes and found them cold and bare and indeterminate, she said, "They'll come back." He was standing behind her, looking at the porch post where the guide wires were still there, and the bare canes followed them in their summer configuration. "Will they? They're built for this," she said. "They go dormant. They wait out the winter. In the spring they come back." He was quiet. "You sound certain," he said. I'm not, she said honestly. But that's what they're supposed to do. And 3 of 8 made it to summer when I wasn't sure any would. I'm going to trust the direction of travel. He stood for another moment looking at the bare canes. All right, he said. She turned and looked at him, this man in his winter coat, with the ridge behind him and the valley below and the long mountain winter settling in again around them both, the same winter that had always been here. The same cold and the same silence and the same Ironpine Ridge, except that none of it was the same at all anymore. Come inside, she said. I've got coffee on. He followed her in. She poured the coffee. He sat at the table, their table, with its 2 chairs that were no longer sufficient and had been joined by 2 more from the back porch, because Garrett and Ilsa came regularly now, and Marin had been up twice, and you needed chairs for people. He sat and wrapped his hands around the cup and looked across the table at her with the gray, direct eyes that had given nothing away the first time she'd seen them, and now, she thought, gave everything away, if you knew how to look. I was thinking, he said. About what? The back room, he said. The one past the spare. It's been storage for 10 years. Nothing in it worth the space it's taking. She waited. There's enough light in there in the afternoon, he said. South-facing window. I was thinking it might be useful. For whatever, if you wanted a room. She looked at him. A room, she said. Your own space, he said, for I don't know. Whatever you need space for. He looked at the table. You do a lot of work at the kitchen table because there's nowhere else. That doesn't seem right long term. She held the thought of that. A room. He was clearing out a room that had been closed for 10 years and offering it to her. Not announcing it as a thing he was doing asking. Or the nearest thing to asking that Calder Rusk was capable of, which looked like stating a practical observation and leaving the door open. I'd like that, she said. He nodded, drank his coffee. I'll get the storage moved out this week, he said. Before the ground freezes hard, I'll help, I know you will, he said. Outside, the November wind came down off the high ridge and moved through the pine trees on the upper slope with the sound she had come to know as the sound of home, not pleasant exactly, not comfortable in any simple sense, but known. Familiar. The sound of a place that had stopped being foreign and become instead the sound of where she was. She thought about what she would put in the room. Her books, the ones still in the second half of the trunk she had unpacked it after he asked her to marry him, item by item, and given each thing its place in the house, and the books had been stacked in the corner of the bedroom, waiting. A chair, a lamp with a good shade, the small writing desk she'd been thinking about building herself if the winter got slow enough. A room of her own on Ironpine Ridge. She thought about the woman who had arrived in October with a trunk and a traveling bag, and the particular composure of someone who had learned not to let strangers see her uncertainty. That woman had looked at a house stripped down to its bones and a man stripped down to his defenses, and had decided, on the basis of very little evidence and a great deal of instinct, that both were worth the time it would take. The evidence had borne it out. Not perfectly, there was nothing perfect about any of it. He still sometimes retreated into silences that lasted too long. She still sometimes pushed on things before he was ready for them, misjudging his pace, having to walk it back. There were mornings when the old habits rose in him and he went to the barn instead of the kitchen table, and she understood but still felt the absence. There were things he would probably never say easily, large emotional truths that would remain, for the length of their lives together, translated into practical language she'd learned to read. None of that was going to change entirely. She had stopped wanting it to. What she wanted, she had, which was the real version of this man, complicated and imperfect, and hers in the most genuine sense, not because he'd been remade into something easier, but because she had understood what was actually there and chosen it with open eyes. That, she thought, was probably the only honest way to love anything. You had to see it clearly first. You had to put down the version you wished existed and look at what was actually in front of you. And then you had to decide whether what was actually in front of you was something you could build with. Not perfect material, not easy material, but real material. True material. If the answer was yes, you stayed. You put your name in the ledger. You hung the curtains. You planted the roses, and you waited for them to come back in the spring. And when they did, when they came up through the late snow with the same stubborn insistence that things built for a hard climate, have you felt something that wasn't surprise, but was close to it? The feeling of a bet placed on something difficult paid out. She got up and added a log to the stove. She came back and sat across from Calder in the kitchen that was warm and used and real, with curtains on the windows and 2 extra chairs and a ledger with 2 names at the top of the page. He looked up. She looked back at him. Neither of them said anything. They didn't need to. There was nothing left that the silence couldn't hold.